My first job out of college was working for the National Park Service as a ranger in training. I was based in Northern California at the time, stationed in a small field office nestled between the Sierra Nevada foothills and the vast redwood territory that stretches north toward Oregon. The work was supposed to be straightforward: document wildlife populations, monitor logging road integrity, record owl activity. Simple science, simple data collection. That is what I told myself every morning when I pulled on my uniform. Simple. The survey protocol we were working that summer had us out on ATVs just after sunset, stopping periodically to mimic owl hoots before listening for their response. We would record the calls, mark them on our maps: drive, stop, call, listen. The rhythm of it was meant to be meditative, almost therapeutic. The Park Service valued these protocols. They funded them. They believed that understanding what lived in these forests, what moved through them in the darkness, what answered when you called out into the void, was essential to protection. I did not understand then what we were actually surveying for. One particular night in late July, I was riding my ATV on a logging road that was right along a river. This was not a park road. This was not marked territory. It was an old logging trail, barely maintained. The asphalt cracked in places and vanished entirely in others, revealing the red dirt underneath. The river ran beside it, the South Fork of the Feather River, low that time of year but still audible through the trees. I remember the sound. I remember how it seemed to mask other sounds, how it seemed to make the forest around me feel both more alive and more isolated. The sun was dropping fast. That is always when things change in the mountains. That is when the light dies and something else wakes up. I had stopped 3 times already that night, mimicked the hooting pattern, waited, listened to the branches and the water and the wind moving through the canopy. No response. That was typical. Not all nights yielded calls. Sometimes the owls were not there. Sometimes they were silent. Sometimes they were listening instead of answering. I was reaching the end of my route, a 6-mile stretch that I had driven dozens of times over the previous month. The forest here was old, Douglas firs that had been standing since before I was born. White oaks twisted into strange shapes by decades of mountain wind. Madrone trees with their peeling red bark, like they were shedding their skin in the heat. The understory was thick with bay laurel and manzanita, and the smell of it all, the richness of it, the weight of living things, was something I had learned to expect but never quite to ignore. I was riding slowly, the engine of the ATV a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through my chest. My headlamp cut through the beginning darkness. The forest ahead of me was turning from green to gray to something closer to black. I was thinking about dinner. I was thinking about the small apartment I rented in town, 20 miles down the highway, where a cold refrigerator and some questionable leftover pizza awaited me. I was thinking about anything except what I should have been thinking about, which was that I had not seen any wildlife all night. Not a deer, not a raccoon, not a single sign of larger animals on the road or in the brush beside it. The forest, usually alive with small movements and distant sounds, felt muted, held, as if something was waiting. I saw the blur first. It was off to the side of the road, deep in the brush to my right, and it moved faster than anything I had ever seen move in these forests before. Not the bounding motion of a deer, not the loping gait of a mountain lion. This was different. This was something running flat out, on 4 legs but with a strange quality to the motion, as if the back legs were doing something different from the front. Before I could process what I was seeing, the bear burst onto the road directly in front of my ATV. I immediately slowed down to avoid hitting it. My instinct was there, sharp and automatic. Do not hit the animal. Do not hit the bear. It was a reflex born from hours of Park Service safety training and weeks of riding these roads. But as I braked, my mind registered the details. The bear was small, smaller than I would have expected. A cub, perhaps, a yearling, something young. And if it was young, then the mother would still be around. I had maybe 5 seconds to think about this as the bear ran ahead of me on the road. 5 seconds that felt like 5 minutes, stretched and distorted by adrenaline. The bear was panicked, that was clear. It was not moving with the casual lumber of a bear that has simply wandered into your path. This was flight. This was flight from something. My eyes went to the brush on the right side of the road, the side the bear had emerged from. I was half expecting to see the massive shape of a mother bear coming through the vegetation. The hair on my arms and neck went rigid. My hands tightened on the ATV handlebars. My foot hovered over the brake, ready to stop completely. ready to abandon the machine if necessary. But nothing emerged. The young bear ran ahead of me on the road for probably 5 seconds before disappearing into the forest on the opposite side, darting between two massive Douglas firs and vanishing into the gloom. I watched it go, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. For a moment, the only sound was the idling engine of my ATV and the rushing of the river. Then the forest was silent again. Completely silent. As soon as the road was clear, I pounded the throttle on the ATV and got out of there. The engine roared. The rear wheels kicked up a spray of gravel and red dust as I accelerated down the logging road. My headlamp bounced wildly ahead of me, the light so unstable that it was almost useless, and I had to force myself to ease back on the throttle before I went off the road into a tree. But I did not stop. I did not go back to investigate. I did not call into the ranger station to report a possible problem. I just drove. In retrospect, the bear was probably a yearling, recently separated from its mother, just old enough to be on its own. The mother was likely nowhere nearby. The bear was probably just as scared of me as I was of it, reacting to the sudden appearance of a loud machine on its territory. The whole thing should have been a mundane wildlife encounter, the kind of thing rangers reported every season, something to note in the logbook and discuss over coffee at the station. But that is retrospect. That is the thinking that comes much later, when you are safe and warm and can afford to be rational about things. In the heat of the moment, there was only the terror and the unknown. In the heat of the moment, I did not know what had scared the bear so badly that it ran into the road directly in front of a moving vehicle. I did not know what was waiting in that brush, and part of me, some deep animal part of me that lives in the dark places where rational thought cannot reach, understood that I had driven away from something that had scared a bear, something that was still out there, in the forest beside that old logging road, watching the taillights of my ATV disappear into the darkness. If you have not already hit the like button on this video, if you have not yet subscribed to hear more of these encounters, I urge you to do so now. What happens next is something that will change your perspective on what lives in the wild places of this country. What happens next is something that should never have happened at all. I filed no report about the bear that night. I told no one at the ranger station what I had seen. I drove home, ate that cold pizza, and told myself that the whole thing was a misunderstanding, a scared animal, a coincidence, the kind of thing that happened all the time in these mountains, nothing more. But 3 days later, I received an assignment to work the same logging road again. And this time, I would learn that the bear had been the least of what was waiting out there in the darkness. This time, I would see something else. This time, I would see something that the protocols had never prepared me for. Something that did not appear in any of the wildlife surveys or the Park Service manuals, something that should not exist at all, and yet, as the weeks that followed would prove, something that was very much real. That bear ran in front of my ATV because it was running for its life, and I have spent every night since wondering what it was running from. I have spent every night since grateful that whatever pursued it did not also pursue me. But my luck, I would come to realize, was not going to hold forever. 3 days after the encounter with the yearling bear, I was assigned back to the same logging road. The assignment came through the regular rotation system, nothing unusual about it, but I remember how my stomach felt when I saw the printout. I remember how my hands went cold when I looked at the route and realized exactly where I would be that evening. I considered calling in sick. I actually thought about it seriously. I could have claimed fatigue. I could have made up some minor injury. The Park Service was understanding about these things, especially with rangers in training. We were expected to have limits. We were expected to be human, but I did not call in sick. I did not make excuses. I went in that evening, collected my equipment, and prepared the ATV, as I always did. Checked the fuel, checked the tire pressure, make sure the headlamp was working, and the communication radio had a good signal. Professional, routine, normal, except nothing felt normal anymore. The moment I had reported for my shift, I felt it. A heaviness in the air, a sense that something fundamental had shifted. The other rangers noticed it too, I think. They were quieter than usual. Their eyes seemed to linger on me a fraction too long when I passed them in the station. Had I told someone about the bear? Had word gotten around? Or was the forest itself communicating something through the network of those who worked there, some wordless warning that something was not right? I never found out. The sun was dropping as I pulled onto the logging road, and I tried to approach the evening as I had approached dozens of others. Science, data collection, the hoot and listen protocol. I was a professional, trained and equipped. There was nothing to be afraid of. The bear was gone. Whatever had scared it was probably long gone as well. The forest, I told myself, was just a forest. Ancient and indifferent and full of ordinary things, but I was lying to myself. I knew I was lying to myself. The kind of fear that I had felt 3 nights earlier does not simply evaporate. It lingers, it settles into your bones and waits. I completed my first 3 stops without incident. Stop, cut the engine, mimic the owl call, listen for a response. Nothing. The forest remained silent in that particular way that means something is wrong. The birds were not calling. The small rustles of nighttime activity seemed muted, as if the forest was holding its breath. At my 4th stop, roughly 2 miles into the route, I noticed something that was wrong in a way I could not immediately articulate. The road ahead of me showed tracks. I killed the ATV engine and climbed off slowly. My boots crunched on the gravel, loud in the unnatural silence, and I approached the tracks on foot. I had been trained to identify animal signs, the prints of the major mammals that inhabited the region. Black bears, mountain lions, deer, even bighorn sheep if you were lucky enough to see them at higher elevations. These prints did not match anything I had been trained to identify. The first print was in the soft shoulder of the road where the asphalt had crumbled away into dirt and gravel. It was impressed deep into the soil, deeper than I would have expected from an ordinary animal. Human-like, I thought at first. Not a hand, but something close. Something with opposable digits and a palm and an arrangement of bones that suggested primate rather than quadruped. But it was not human. The print was too large for one thing. Much too large. A human foot, stretched out in a hiking boot, would have measured maybe 12 inches long and 4 inches wide. This print was nearly 16 inches long and just under 7 inches across the widest point. The depth of the impression suggested considerable weight. Considerable mass. The toes were spread differently than a human toe would spread. The digits seemed to have a different range of motion, a different articulation. And the claw marks, the long gouges in the soil that extended past the end of what might have been toenails, spoke to something with an offensive capability that no human possessed. I stood staring at the print for a long time. Minutes, probably, though I would not have been able to say exactly how long if someone had asked me. My mind was trying to process what my eyes were seeing. Trying to fit this thing into the categories I understood. Animal, human, something I could name and classify and file away into the proper mental drawer. But the print did not fit into any drawer. I looked down the road ahead of me, and there was another print, then another, a trail of them, leading down the logging road in the direction I had been heading. The creature, whatever it was, had walked down the center line of the asphalt, not bothering to hide its passage. It walked with a gait that I could almost visualize from the prints. A stride length of something like 4.5 feet, suggesting either tremendous leg length or a deliberate stalking pace. The prints were fresh. The edges of them had not had time to settle or blur. Rain had not washed them. Wind had not scattered the loose dirt. They had been made recently. Within hours, probably. Maybe within the last hour. I turned and looked back down the road behind me, the direction I had come. There were prints there too, approaching from further up the road. The same gait, the same impressions, the same massive, impossible track. It had been following the road, moving along the same path that I drove every night. I looked at my ATV, parked 20 feet away, and I made a decision. I was not going to investigate further. I was not going to continue down the road to see where the tracks led. I was not going to try to follow this thing into the forest and determine what it was. I was going to report this to the ranger station. I was going to get photographs. I was going to let the professionals, the experienced rangers who had been doing this for years, deal with whatever this was. I walked back to the ATV, trying to keep my movements calm and deliberate, as if there was nothing wrong, as if I was simply returning to my vehicle for a routine reason. My hands were shaking when I reached for the communication radio mounted on the handlebars. The radio was dead. I pressed the transmit button. Nothing. No static, no squeal of feedback, no indication that the device was functioning at all. I checked the battery level. It should have been full. I had charged it that morning. But the battery indicator showed a line of red, completely depleted, as if something had drained it while I was standing off the ATV examining the prints. I checked the time. It was 18:47, not yet fully dark, still maybe 20 minutes of usable light left in the sky. I could drive back to the ranger station, about 20 miles away. I could make it there in something under 30 minutes, even on roads I did not entirely trust in the dimming light. I could get help and return with someone else, someone more experienced, someone who could explain what I had found. I started the ATV. The engine turned over immediately, responsive and normal, as if nothing at all was wrong. I put the machine in gear and began driving back the way I had come, away from the tracks, away from whatever direction they led. I drove faster than I should have on that road, faster than safety protocols dictated, and I did not look back. I reached the ranger station in 28 minutes. I parked the ATV in the storage area and walked into the building with the photographs I had managed to take with my personal camera. 5 prints, clearly visible in the dirt at the edge of the road. No context, just the massive impressions, the claw marks, the digits spread in that impossible configuration. I showed them to Chief Ranger Tom, the senior ranger at our station. Tom had been working these mountains for 22 years. He had seen animals of every kind that the region had to offer. He had investigated problem bears and mountain lion sightings. He had dealt with wildlife incidents that would have terrified most people. When he looked at those photographs, the color drained from his face. He did not say anything for a long time. He just stared at the images, turning the camera around, looking at them from different angles. Then he looked up at me, and I saw something in his expression that I had not expected. I had expected skepticism, or confusion, or professional curiosity. What I saw was fear, and below the fear, something else. Something that looked like recognition. Tom took the camera from my hands and walked to his office without saying a word. I stood in the main area of the station, waiting. 10 minutes passed, 20. Other rangers came in and out. Nobody asked me anything. Nobody seemed to notice me standing there, holding my breath, waiting for an explanation. Finally, Tom emerged from his office. He handed me the camera. His face had settled into an expression of bureaucratic neutrality, but his eyes still held that fear. He told me that the photographs were interesting. He told me that they looked like the prints of a bear, probably a large male black bear with a birth defect or injury that had affected its paw structure. He told me that these things happened sometimes in wildlife populations, that the National Park Service would make a note of it, and that I should continue my regular survey routes. He was lying. I knew he was lying. The photographs showed no such thing. There was nothing in those images that could be rationalized as a malformed bear print. But I also understood something else. I understood that Tom knew what those prints actually represented, and I understood that whatever he knew, he was not going to share it with a ranger in training who was barely 3 months into the job. I left the station an hour later, having been released from my shift. I drove home in my personal vehicle, a battered 1998 Honda Civic that I had bought used, and I did not look back. The next morning, I called in and requested reassignment. I told my supervisor that I had become interested in a different aspect of park management. I told him that I wanted to focus on trail maintenance rather than wildlife surveys. He granted the request without hesitation, almost as if he had been expecting it. I was moved to a different rotation, working on hiking trails in the eastern section of the park, 5 miles away from that logging road and the river and the impossible prints in the dirt. For 2 weeks, I tried to convince myself that the matter was closed. I had seen something strange. I had reported it to the appropriate authorities. The authorities had determined that it was not a cause for concern. The proper channels had been engaged. The system had worked. I was safe now, and the strange encounter was nothing more than a curiosity, a moment of oddity in an otherwise ordinary job. But I could not stop thinking about Tom's face when he saw the photographs. I could not stop wondering what he knew and what he was hiding. And most of all, I could not stop thinking about those prints, that gate, that trail leading down the logging road into the darkness. Something massive was moving through these mountains, something that left tracks I had never been taught to recognize. And the people who governed these lands, the rangers and the Park Service officials who were supposed to protect people like me, knew about it. They knew, and they were not saying anything. 2 weeks later, on a Friday evening, Tom appeared at my new workstation. He found me alone, working on trail repairs near Deer Cove, well away from the main facilities. He did not come as my supervisor. He came quietly, in his personal truck, and he waited until I was alone before he approached me. He told me to get in the truck. He told me that there were things I needed to know. He told me that the forest I was working in was not as empty as I had been led to believe, and he told me to brace myself, because the worst was still to come. Tom drove me to a small clearing off the main park road, a place I had never been before, though it was only 3 miles from the ranger station. It was dark by the time we arrived, and the forest around us felt different from the areas where I had been working. Older, somehow, more watched. Tom cut the engine, and we sat in silence for a long moment. Then he told me the truth. The Park Service had known about the creature for years, not just suspected or speculated, knew. There were old reports dating back to the 1970s of something massive moving through these mountains, something that left prints like the ones I had found. Something that was seen occasionally by rangers and hikers, though official reports of these sightings were discouraged, buried, kept out of the public record. The creature was a Bigfoot. That was what the regional office called it, in the internal communications that were kept in locked filing cabinets in air-conditioned offices, far from public scrutiny. A Sasquatch, the monster of American folklore, the creature that supposedly did not exist, that was impossible, that belonged in the same category as the Loch Ness Monster and the Chupacabra, except it was real, it was living in these mountains, and it was not alone. Tom told me that there were at least 3 of them that they had documented, maybe more. The creatures were territorial but not aggressive, at least not toward humans who kept their distance. They avoided detection. They knew the Park Service presence. They moved at night when possible. They had learned to coexist with the rangers by staying away from them. But something was changing. Over the past 6 months, the sightings had increased. The creatures were moving closer to the developed areas of the park. There had been incidents of property damage. Food stores at remote stations had been raided. Tracks had been appearing in places where they had never appeared before, and 3 weeks ago, a hiker had disappeared. Her name was Eleanor Vasquez. She was 42 years old, a solo backpacker who had been hiking through the park for 6 days. She was experienced, she was well-equipped. She had filed her route with the ranger station and checked in at each of the waypoints as she was supposed to. She had not checked in at the final waypoint. When the Park Service went to look for her, they found her campsite. They found her equipment scattered. They found her blood on the trees. They did not find Eleanor. The search had been kept quiet. The official statement was that she had decided to extend her trip and had simply not returned when expected. The Park Service had contacted her family and explained that she was fine, just off the grid for a little longer. The family, relieved that she was alive, had not raised the alarm. But Eleanor Vasquez was not fine. Eleanor Vasquez was not anywhere that any search team could find her. Tom believed, though he could not prove it, that she had been killed by one of the Bigfoot creatures. That something about her presence, something about her alone in the forest night, had triggered an aggressive response. That whatever the creatures usually were, whatever arrangement they had made with the human presence in their territory, had been violated. And now, Tom said, those creatures were getting bolder, hungrier, maybe, or more confident. The boundaries were shifting. The unspoken truce was breaking down. He told me all of this while we sat in his truck in that clearing, the forest dark around us, the sound of wind in the branches, and something else, something like breathing, in the distance. He told me that he was telling me this for a specific reason. He told me that the Park Service could not make an official statement about what was happening. The liability would be enormous. The panic would be even worse. The media would descend on the park. The wilderness would be overrun with hunters and thrill-seekers and people desperate to prove that Bigfoot existed. But the rangers needed to know. The people who worked in this forest, who moved through it at night and in the early mornings, needed to know what was hunting them. They needed to know what to watch for and how to protect themselves. And Tom, for reasons he would not fully explain, seemed to believe that I was someone who needed to know especially urgently. He drove me back to my apartment around midnight. He did not say much during the drive. When we arrived, he told me to get a transfer. He told me to leave this park, leave this region if I could, and never come back. He told me that the problem was only going to get worse. I did not leave. I should have left. Every rational part of my mind understood that Tom was telling me to do the smart thing, the safe thing, the thing that would preserve my life and my sanity. But I did not leave. I wanted to know more. I wanted to see proof. I wanted to know what was really happening in these mountains. So I made a decision that I have regretted every day since. I asked Tom if I could help. I asked him if there was something I could do, some way I could be part of the solution. I asked him if I could go back to the logging road. Tom said no, absolutely not. He was adamant. The logging road was off limits for me. I was not trained. I was not prepared. I was not experienced enough to handle what was happening there. But Tom also knew that I was going to go anyway. He knew because he could see it in my face. He knew because I was young and stupid and convinced of my own invincibility in the way that young people always are. So instead of refusing outright, he made me a deal. He would take me on a documented survey, a legitimate ranger activity, to an area where the creatures had been sighted. We would go during the day. We would take proper precautions. We would bring everything we needed to protect ourselves, and we would see what we could find. He would help me understand what I was dealing with. 3 days later, we set out on that survey. Tom led me to a remote area of the park, a narrow valley that fed into a canyon system, an area that was rarely visited by hikers because the trails were poorly maintained and the terrain was treacherous. This was not protected wilderness. This was wild wilderness, the kind of place where the Park Service presence was almost non-existent, where the forests had not been walked on by human feet in weeks or months or longer. We brought rifles for bears, Tom said. We brought satellite communication. We brought enough food and water for 3 days. We brought thermal imaging cameras and motion sensors. We brought the equipment of people who were looking for something, even though Tom never said explicitly what we were looking for. The first night, we camped in a small clearing near the canyon's mouth. I was hyper-aware of every sound, every crack of a branch, every rustling in the underbrush, every far-off call of an animal in the darkness seemed magnified and terrifying. But nothing happened. We sat by the fire and Tom told me more of what he knew. He told me that the creatures seemed to be intelligent, not human intelligent, but something close. They used tools sometimes. They left markings on trees that seemed deliberate. Not the casual scrape of an animal, but something that suggested communication or territorial marking with purpose behind it. They avoided traps. They knew when humans were nearby and would disappear into the deep forest, seemingly able to move through terrain that should have been impassable for creatures of their size. They hunted at night mostly, but sometimes, and this terrified Tom more than anything else, sometimes they hunted in daylight, which meant they were either hungry or they were no longer afraid. The second day of the survey, we found the clearing. It was roughly circular, maybe 30 feet across, and it was surrounded by trees that had been stripped of their bark, torn open, the wood beneath exposed to the air. The damage was not fresh, but it was not ancient either. The wounds in the trees looked weeks old, maybe a month old, and in the center of the clearing, there were prints, dozens of them, hundreds maybe. The same massive footprints that I had seen on the logging road, but these were arranged in a pattern that suggested movement, gathering, congregation. The creatures had been here, probably more than one, maybe all of them at once. Tom knelt down and examined the prints carefully. His face had gone very pale. He said that he had never seen anything like this before. He said that the creatures were usually solitary or traveled in small family groups. He said that he had never heard of them gathering like this. He said that this was new. This was something that was changing. And then I noticed something that Tom had missed. Among the massive prints, there were smaller prints. Older prints, barely visible beneath the layer of debris that had fallen over them. They were human-sized. They were female-sized, based on the width and shape of the foot. They were Eleanor Vasquez prints. They led into the trees on the far side of the clearing, and they did not lead back out. Tom went very quiet when I pointed this out. He did not examine them closely. He simply looked at them and then looked away. He said we should leave. He said we should break camp immediately and head back to the ranger station. He said that the creatures had found Eleanor because the forest had shown her to them, that the park itself, in some way that he could not explain and refused to try, was somehow complicit in what happened to her, that there was a relationship between the deep places and the creatures that lived in them, a communion that predated human understanding. He said a lot of things that did not sound rational, coming from a trained ranger, coming from a man who dealt in facts and wildlife protocols and scientific observation. But I understood that Tom was afraid, not of the creatures themselves, but of something larger, something about the way the forest worked, something about the boundary between the human and the wild that was thinner than I had ever realized. We did not stay to investigate further. We packed up the camp, and we drove back to the ranger station in near complete silence. Tom made me promise not to tell anyone what I had seen. He made me promise not to file any official reports about Eleanor Vasquez or about the prints in the clearing. He made me promise to carry a weapon at all times, a knife at minimum, a gun preferably. He made me promise to never be alone in the forest again. I promised all of these things, and then, 2 weeks later, I violated every single one of those promises because I got a call from the ranger station. Not from Tom, but from another ranger, someone new, someone I did not know. He said that there had been another hiker report a sighting. A family, hiking in the northern section of the park, had reported seeing something massive moving through the trees at dusk. Something that walked on 2 legs. Something that was too large to be human. The family was being interviewed. The incident was being documented. Official protocols were being followed. And I had a chance, he said, to be part of the investigation. I had a chance to be part of the ranger team that was going to determine what was really happening in these mountains. I packed a bag. I told no one where I was going. I drove to the ranger station and I reported for my assignment. I was going back to that logging road. I was going back to the place where everything had started, and this time I was not going to run away. The assignment seemed simple enough on paper. A family hiking report, a sighting investigation, standard protocol, routine business. But when I arrived at the ranger station, I found that the entire tone had shifted. The casual professionalism that usually characterized the station had been replaced by something tense and urgent. Rangers were checking weapons, equipment was being sorted and prioritized. There was a military efficiency to everything, the kind of efficiency that only emerges when people have stopped pretending that something is normal. Tom was waiting for me in the equipment room. He looked like he had not slept in days. His eyes had a hollow quality, and his hands shook slightly when he handed me a rifle and showed me how to load it. He said that it was not just the family report. There had been 3 incidents in the past week, 3 separate sightings, 3 separate encounters. The creatures were moving out of the deep territory. They were appearing closer to civilization. They were appearing in places where they had never appeared before, and something about their behavior had changed. They were no longer avoiding humans. They were investigating humans, moving toward them instead of away. The family had been hiking on one of the main trails, the kind of place where several other families would have been present. It was the middle of the afternoon, still light, still what most people would have considered safe. That was when the creature appeared, not running, not fleeing, walking slowly into a visible clearing, looking at the family, looking directly at them, for what the hikers described as 10 full seconds before turning and departing into the forest. 10 seconds was not a lot of time, but in the context of what I now understood, it was an eternity. It was not an animal observing humans. It was an animal deciding something about humans, making a choice, evaluating. Tom said that the Park Service was now in a position where they could no longer ignore what was happening. The incident had too many witnesses. The family had already mentioned the sighting to other people, and word was spreading. There was going to be a formal investigation. There was going to be a press statement. There was going to be an attempt to explain what was happening in a way that did not cause mass panic. The official story, Tom said, was going to be that a Bigfoot or Sasquatch-like creature had been sighted in the park. A solitary creature, probably. Habituated to humans but not aggressive. A rare opportunity for research and documentation. The park would close the trails where it had been seen. Researchers would be brought in. The situation would be handled professionally. The official story was a lie. But it was a lie that would allow the park to remain open, the tourism to continue, the revenue to flow. It was the best lie that anyone could come up with under the circumstances. But Tom said something else, something that he did not put in the official briefing. He said that in the past 3 days he had found 2 more clearings like the one we had discovered together. Clearings with multiple prints, with stripped trees, with signs of congregation. The creatures were not just moving closer to the trails, they were gathering, they were organizing. Something was happening in the deep places of the forest that was coordinated and intentional, and he believed, though he could not prove it and would not say it officially, that it was related to hunger, that something in the forest was dying, that the ecosystem that had sustained these creatures was failing, and they were being driven to the populated areas by necessity rather than choice. He said that this made them more dangerous than if they were simply aggressive by nature. Hungry creatures are unpredictable. They are desperate. They are capable of things that sated creatures would never attempt. I asked him if Eleanor Vasquez had been killed by hunger or by something else. He did not answer. The investigation began the next morning. A team of 5 rangers, including Tom and myself, was assigned to the trail system where the family had made their report. We were supposed to look for tracks, for evidence of regular movement, for signs that could be used to document where the creature or creatures were spending their time. What we were really doing was looking for a way to kill them and bury the evidence. I did not understand this at first. But as the day progressed, as we found fresh prints and began to follow them, as Tom consulted with the other rangers in conversations just out of my hearing, I began to realize that the Park Service was not interested in documentation or research or the preservation of these creatures. The Park Service was interested in extinction. We followed the trail for hours. It led away from the hiking paths and deep into the forest, through terrain that was increasingly difficult to navigate. The prints we found became fresher as we moved deeper. The vegetation was disturbed. Tree branches were broken. The ground had been torn up by the passage of something heavy. By mid-afternoon, we reached a clearing at the end of a small canyon. This clearing was larger than the others Tom had shown me, maybe 60 feet across. And at the center of the clearing, partially concealed by brush, there was a cave entrance. The prints led directly to it, dozens of them, all converging on that single point. And around the cave, scattered on the ground, were bones. They were large bones, some of them as thick as my arm. They had been stripped of flesh but not cleaned, not processed with any care. They had the look of remains that had been scattered after feeding. I saw what looked like the ball joint of a shoulder, a long femur, curved and thick, ribs arranged haphazardly, scapulae. They were human-sized. Tom examined them carefully, using a stick to move them around, careful not to touch them directly. His face had gone completely bloodless. He said that these were old, months old at least. He said that he recognized some of the weathering patterns. He said that he believed some of these bones dated back to Eleanor Vasquez's disappearance. But he also said that there were others, fresher remains, things that were not yet fully skeletonized, things that suggested more recent predation. I asked him how many people had disappeared in this region in the past year. How many hikers had not returned? How many missing person reports had been filed that had been written off as accidental deaths or voluntary vanishings? He would not answer. He simply stared at the bones and the cave entrance, and something in his expression suggested that the number was higher than either of us wanted to contemplate. The other rangers were checking the perimeter of the clearing, securing it, looking for additional evidence. One of them, a man named Davis, called out from near the tree line. He had found something. It was a rucksack, a hiking backpack, weathered and torn and half buried in the forest detritus. Tom identified it as belonging to Marcus Chen, a hiker who had disappeared 3 months earlier, a solo backpacker like Eleanor, an experienced wilderness trekker who had filed his route with the ranger station, a man who had simply never returned. We did not enter the cave. Tom said that would be too dangerous, that we did not know how many creatures were in there or what their response would be if we invaded their den. We did not know if there was a mother protecting young, if there were territorial displays of aggression, if the creatures would defend what they had there. So instead we backed away slowly, carefully, maintaining silence. We retreated from the clearing and we regrouped at a distance, and then Tom made his decision. He said that the operation would proceed as planned. The creatures in that cave would be dealt with. The ranger team would return at dawn, fully armed and equipped. They would seal the cave entrance, if that was possible. They would be prepared to neutralize any creatures that emerged. This was, he said, now a matter of human safety. The creatures had crossed a line. They had moved from being wildlife to being a direct threat. The Park Service could not allow human predation. The creatures had to be eliminated. I remember thinking, as he said this, that this was when the boundary between human and animal became absolute. This was when humans stopped observing and started destroying. This was when the forest became not a place of wonder and scientific inquiry, but a battleground. This was when everything changed. We returned to the ranger station as darkness fell. Tom immediately went into a meeting with the regional office directors. The rest of us were told to rest, to be ready at dawn, to prepare ourselves for what was coming. I tried to sleep. I could not. I lay in a bunk room with the other rangers, listening to them breathing, listening to the night sounds outside the station windows, thinking about the cave and the bones and Eleanor Vasquez and how long she must have suffered before the end came. I thought about Tom and what he was not saying and why he seemed to believe that I needed to be part of this operation. I thought about whether he thought I would be grateful for the opportunity to be part of the destruction, or whether he thought I would understand something that I had not yet grasped. Around 3 in the morning, I could not stand it anymore. I left the bunk room and walked outside to get air. The night was clear and cold, and stars filled the sky in a way that I had rarely seen before. The forest around the ranger station was silent, watchful. Tom found me standing on the porch looking out into the darkness. He said that he needed to tell me something that he could not tell the other rangers. He said that he had found something in the cave clearing that he had not mentioned to anyone else. He said that there had been markings on the cave walls, deliberate markings, arranged in patterns that could not be accidental. Scratches and symbols that suggested some form of communication or record-keeping. And he said that some of the markings matched markings that he had seen before, in the old ranger logs, from decades ago, from before the Park Service had decided to start ignoring the creature sightings. He said that these creatures had been using that cave for a very long time, that this cave was not a recent den but a long-standing refuge, that they had been hunting from this cave for longer than anyone had officially acknowledged that they existed. And he said that he believed the creatures understood that they were being hunted, that they had anticipated this moment, that they were waiting for the rangers to come. He said that when we approached that cave at dawn, they would not run, they would not hide. They would be waiting at the entrance, and they would be ready for war. I asked him if he was sure, if he was absolutely certain of this. He said that he could feel it, that the forest was telling him, that something in the air and the darkness and the way the wind was moving was communicating something to the rangers, if we were only sensitive enough to listen. He said that this was not going to be a quick operation. This was not going to be a simple matter of shooting creatures and walking away. He said that something was going to happen in that forest that would change all of us, that before the sun rose, one or more of us would not be returning to the ranger station. He said that he had already decided that he was going to go into that cave, no matter what was waiting. That one of us needed to see what was really inside, that we needed to know what we were dealing with before we started firing. And he said that he was choosing me to go with him. I told him no. I told him that I was not trained enough, not experienced enough, not ready for what he was describing. He said that he was not asking me if I was ready. He was telling me that this was what needed to happen. This was what I had chosen when I decided not to leave the park. This was the consequence of my choices. And as dawn began to break over the mountains, as the darkness started to fade and the forest began to wake, Tom and I loaded our rifles and prepared ourselves for what was coming. We were going to go into that cave. We were going to see what was waiting in the darkness, and we were going to discover the truth about what lived in these mountains, and what lived would reveal the truth about us in return. We drove back to the canyon clearing while the sun was still rising, painting the sky in shades of orange and red and gold. The other rangers were already there, establishing a perimeter, checking their weapons, going through the motions of preparation. There was very little conversation. Everyone seemed to understand that something significant was about to occur. Tom said he wanted to approach the cave mouth alone. He said he wanted to assess the situation before the full team made any aggressive moves. He said that his years of experience gave him a better chance of not triggering an attack, and that the creature might be willing to negotiate, or at least to hold its position, if only one human approached. The other rangers did not like this plan. Davis in particular argued against it, saying that it violated every protocol, that it put Tom at unnecessary risk, that there was no way to guarantee that a creature known to have killed humans would simply allow a single ranger to walk up to its den and scout it without attacking. But Tom was in charge. Tom was the senior ranger. Tom's authority was not questioned, so I was chosen to accompany him, with Davis and two other rangers, Martinez and Chen, maintaining a perimeter 100 feet back from the cave entrance, rifles ready, prepared to provide covering fire if necessary. We moved slowly toward the cave. Tom kept his rifle lowered, not pointed at the cave mouth but held loosely, one-handed, giving the appearance of readiness without the aggressive posture of a man preparing to shoot. I mirrored his movements, trying to calm my breathing, trying not to think about Eleanor Vasquez or Marcus Chen or any of the other people whose bones we had found scattered in this place. The cave entrance was larger up close than it had appeared from a distance. The opening was maybe 10 feet across and perhaps 8 feet tall, dark beyond the first couple feet, the interior receding into shadows that the morning sun could not penetrate. The smell coming from it was overwhelming. Not rotting, exactly, but something organic and ancient and wrong. Something like the smell of den animals, multiplied and intensified, and containing notes of decay that spoke to processes I did not want to contemplate. We stopped 20 feet from the entrance. Tom waited. He did not call out. He did not make any loud noises. He simply stood there, rifle held loosely, and waited. For several minutes, nothing happened. The cave remained silent and dark and still. I began to think that maybe the creatures were not here. Maybe they had moved on. Maybe they had abandoned the den when they realized that humans had found them. Then there was movement in the shadows at the back of the cave entrance. It started as a subtle shifting of the darkness, a suggestion of something large moving within the recesses of the cave. Then gradually, slowly, something emerged into the light. It was not a creature. It was the creature. The Bigfoot itself, and it was nothing like I had imagined it would be. In all the stories and legends and fuzzy video footage, Bigfoot is portrayed as something almost human. A large ape, yes, but with an undeniable similarity to humans. Bipedal, roughly humanoid in its proportions. Furry but recognizable. What emerged from that cave was something more alien than that. It was certainly bipedal, and it was certainly large, but it was also something that seemed to belong to a category of being that predated the division between human and animal. It stood approximately 9 feet tall, its body covered in thick, dark hair that was matted and discolored in places, revealing patches of darker skin beneath. The arms were long, much longer than a human's, ending in hands that had fingers, but fingers that were disturbingly different from human fingers, longer and more articulated, and tipped with what looked like genuine claws, not trimmed or worn but maintained, sharpened. The face was the most disturbing part. It had a brow ridge that was pronounced and thick, giving it a furrowed, perpetually angry appearance. The eyes were set deeper than human eyes, and they were intelligent, terrifyingly intelligent. The nose was flatter and broader than a human nose, with wider nostrils. The mouth was partially open, revealing teeth that were not human teeth, not primate teeth exactly, but something that suggested an omnivorous diet with a capacity for both grazing and predation. And those eyes, those intelligent, watching eyes, moved from Tom to me and then back to Tom again, evaluating, assessing, deciding something about our presence. Tom did not move. He did not raise his rifle. He simply stood there, looking at the creature, and I could hear him breathing, slow and steady, a rhythm that suggested he was trying to communicate calm. The creature took a step forward. Its foot was massive, larger than any print I had seen, and it placed it carefully on the ground before taking another step. It was moving slowly, deliberately, not an aggressive charge but a measured advance. It was closing the distance between itself and Tom. I raised my rifle. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely aim. Every instinct in my body was screaming to shoot, to kill, to stop this thing from getting any closer to Tom. Tom put up his hand. A small gesture, a subtle movement, but it was enough. Do not shoot. Stand down. The creature was maybe 10 feet away now. It could have killed both of us in seconds if it had decided to charge. But it did not charge. It simply stood there, watching Tom, and I realized that something was being communicated between them. Some understanding that had no words, no sound, just a recognition passing between two beings. Tom spoke. His voice was quiet and steady and calm. He said that he was not here to hurt the creature. He said that others were coming, but he wanted to understand first. He wanted to know what had happened here. He wanted to know why. The creature made a sound. It was not a growl or a roar. It was something more like a vocalization, a low rumble that came from deep in its chest, complex and layered in a way that suggested language, and Tom answered. He made a sound back, not the same sound, but something similar in quality, a rumble of his own, lower and less practiced, but with intention behind it. I realized that Tom had been preparing for this moment for years, that he had learned the language of these creatures, that this was not an encounter that was beginning, but a continuation of something that had been ongoing for a very long time. The creature took another step closer. It was now close enough that Tom could have reached out and touched it if he had wanted to. The creature's smell was overwhelming, a musk that seemed to burn in my nostrils, an odor that carried with it a sense of power and dominance and territorial presence. The creature raised one of its massive hands. Its movements were slow, careful, non-threatening, and it reached toward Tom's face. I wanted to scream. I wanted to pull Tom away. I wanted to shoot, but I did nothing. I simply watched as the creature's clawed fingers came closer to Tom's face, and then it touched him. It brushed the side of Tom's face gently, almost tenderly, its claws not extended but retracted, the touch firm but not harmful. It was a gesture of greeting, an acknowledgement. Tom stood perfectly still, allowing the contact. And when the creature withdrew its hand, he spoke again. His voice was quieter now, almost a whisper, and the words he used were not English. They were something that sounded vaguely like English, but with tones and guttural sounds that seemed to come from a different part of the throat than human speech emerged from. The creature responded with a longer vocalization, a sound that seemed to contain multiple layers of information, as if it was telling a story or conveying complex information that could not be captured in the simple emotional states of pleasure or anger or fear. Tom responded again. Back and forth, a conversation that was happening beyond my comprehension. A discussion that seemed to be about something other than immediate threats or territorial disputes. It was almost intellectual in its quality, like two scholars discussing a complex topic, though one of them was 9 feet tall and covered in fur and possessed the strength to tear a human body into pieces. Then something changed. The creature's posture shifted. Its vocalizations became shorter, sharper, more staccato. Its hand made a fist, and it looked back into the cave, back into the darkness from which it had emerged. Tom's face went very pale. He asked the creature something, and the creature responded. And then Tom slowly turned around and looked at me. His expression told me that everything had changed, that something I did not understand had just been communicated, that some boundary had just been crossed. He said to me, quietly, that we needed to leave. We needed to back away slowly. We needed to get back to the perimeter, and we needed to tell the other rangers that this operation was being called off. I asked him what had happened. What had the creature said? Tom said that the creature had told him that there was a young one inside the cave, a juvenile, and that the creature was protecting it, that it would not allow us to take the juvenile, that if we attempted to harm it or capture it, the creature would kill us. All of us. And more importantly, Tom said, the creature had told him that this was not about hunger. This was not about predatory instinct run rampant. This was about defense. The creatures in this cave were protecting something. There was a purpose to their presence here. There was a reason beyond simple animal instinct for the pattern of disappearances and kills. The creature had told Tom that humans had taken one of the young ones years ago. The creature had explained, through vocalizations and gestures and an understanding that seemed to transcend the barrier of species, that the juveniles in this cave were the offspring of that stolen young one, that somewhere in the human world, in the human civilization that surrounded this forest, there was a Bigfoot that had been captured, contained, hidden away. And these creatures, the adults in this cave, were trying to find it. They were trying to reclaim it. And the pattern of disappearances was not random predation but targeted hunting. They were killing humans to send a message, to demonstrate that they were serious, to force the human authorities to acknowledge their existence and negotiate. And Eleanor Vasquez had not simply been a victim, she had been an opportunity. She had been in the wrong place, and the creatures had been desperate enough, angry enough, frustrated enough, to take her, to take anyone, to keep taking until the humans listened. We retreated slowly, backing away from the cave entrance, from the massive creature that stood watching us, from the implications of what Tom had just told me. When we were 50 feet away, we turned and walked quickly back to the perimeter. The other rangers immediately asked what had happened. Tom said that there was a juvenile in the cave, and that there was no indication that the creatures were immediately threatening. He said we needed to establish a containment protocol rather than an elimination protocol. He said we needed to contact the regional office and inform them that we had made contact with the creatures and that negotiation was now possible. Davis said that he did not understand. He said that contact with humans had ended in deaths. He said that negotiation with a creature that had killed multiple people was not an option. He said that we had a clear mandate to eliminate the threat. Tom said that the threat was only a threat if we treated it as one. He said that if we approached with weapons, with lethal intent, then yes, the creatures would defend themselves and people would die. But if we approached as a peaceful entity, if we listened to what they were trying to communicate, then there was a possibility of resolution. The other rangers did not like this. Martinez and Chen backed Davis. They thought Tom had been compromised somehow. They thought that the creature had somehow influenced his judgment, or that Tom had simply lost his nerve. But Tom had rank and authority. Tom could make the orders stand. We left the canyon clearing. We returned to the ranger station. Tom immediately went into the regional office to file his report. The other rangers dispersed, uncertain and angry, convinced that something was wrong with Tom's thinking, and I was left alone with the knowledge that I could not communicate to anyone, the understanding that there was a Bigfoot somewhere in human captivity, and the certainty that before this was over, people were going to die. Because Tom was wrong about one thing. He believed that negotiation was possible. He believed that if the authorities understood what the creatures wanted, if we could facilitate the return of the captured young one, then the killings would stop. But I did not believe that. Looking back at the cave, at the dark entrance, at the massive shape of the creature standing just inside the threshold, I realized that I was seeing something that could not be resolved through negotiation. I was seeing a cycle of violence that had its own momentum. I was seeing a war that had been started long before Eleanor Vasquez ever stepped foot on that hiking trail. A war that predated human understanding of these creatures. A war that would not end simply because some humans decided to listen. The creatures in that cave were not interested in negotiation. They were interested in revenge. Everything that followed happened quickly, with the terrible momentum of events that have already been set in motion, that cannot be stopped, that will follow their course regardless of human intention or will. Tom filed his report with the regional office. He explained the situation in terms that were as careful and measured as he could make them. emphasizing the potential for peaceful resolution, the evidence of intelligence and communication, the possibility of meeting the creature's demands if those demands could be determined. The regional office listened. They took Tom's report seriously enough to contact higher authority. Within 24 hours, there were federal agents at the ranger station, biologists and cryptozoologists and representatives from the Department of Wildlife. There was even, though this was never officially acknowledged, someone from a private research facility that specialized in primate studies. That person arrived with photographs. They arrived with documents. They arrived with the answer to the question that had been gnawing at Tom and me since the creatures had communicated about the captured young one. The young Bigfoot had been in captivity for 14 years. It had been captured when it was no more than 3 years old, taken from the Sierra Nevada mountains by a team of private researchers who believed they had found proof of a species that science had dismissed as myth. The capture had been orchestrated carefully, with tranquilizers and trucks and networks of people who had been paid to keep quiet about what they had found. The creature had been kept in a facility 200 miles away, on private land in the Central Valley, in a compound that had been purpose-built to contain it. The facility's director was a man named Dr. Morrison, someone who had dedicated his career to proving that Bigfoot existed, who had spent his fortune on research and capture operations and the maintenance of his captive specimen. Dr. Morrison believed that he had made the scientific find of the century. He believed that his captive Bigfoot would revolutionize human understanding of evolution and primate behavior. He believed that the creature was content, fed well, maintained in conditions that were adequate for its survival. He had no idea that the creature's family had been searching for it, that the creatures in these mountains had been sending out scouts and trackers for years, desperately trying to locate the missing young one, that the pattern of violence that had emerged in the past 6 months was a direct response to finding evidence, a trail, a direction. The creatures had not known where the young one was being kept, but they had known the general region. They had sent searchers into the populated areas, moving closer to human civilization than they had done in decades, trying to find the right place, the right facility. And when they had not found it quickly enough, when human civilization had continued to ignore their communications, they had begun to kill. Not in feeding frenzy, but in calculated demonstration. "Look at us," they were saying. "We are here. We are real. We are powerful. Listen to us, or people will continue to die." The federal authorities were faced with an unprecedented situation. They had proof that Bigfoot existed. They had a captured specimen in a private facility. They had a wild population of the creatures, demonstrated to be intelligent and communicative and capable of directed violence. And they had no protocol, no legal framework, no precedent for how to handle any of this. But they did have one clear advantage. They had leverage. They could access the captive creature and use it to negotiate with the wild population. A decision was made. The federal team would go to Dr. Morrison's facility. They would, legally if possible or otherwise if necessary, acquire the captive Bigfoot. They would bring it back to the Sierra Nevada. They would facilitate a reunion between the captured creature and its family. The theory was that this would satisfy the creature's demands, that the violence would stop, that the creatures would retreat back into the deep forests and the boundaries would be restored. The theory was reasonable. The theory was rational. The theory was also completely and utterly wrong. The captive Bigfoot was brought to the ranger station 3 days later. It arrived in a specialized transport container, a large crate mounted on a truck. The creature inside sedated but alive, its breathing slow and measured, its eyes closed as if it were sleeping a sleep from which it might never wake. I was present when they opened the container. I watched as the creature was carefully unloaded and placed in a secure pen that had been hastily constructed near the ranger station. I watched as it lay on the ground, still sedated, still unconscious, as if it was a thing rather than a being, an object to be managed rather than a life to be preserved. Tom stood beside me. He said that this was the moment of truth. He said that when this creature woke up, when it became aware of where it was, when it potentially encountered its family again, everything would be determined. He said that this was when we would discover whether the creatures could be negotiated with or whether we had simply escalated a conflict that would now result in wholesale slaughter. The sedation wore off around dusk. The young Bigfoot woke in the pen, and it made a sound. Not a roar or a scream, but a vocalization that seemed to contain years of confusion and pain and displacement compressed into a single utterance. The sound carried across the ranger station and into the forest beyond. And somewhere out there, somewhere in the mountains, something heard it and responded. Within an hour, the first of the wild creatures appeared at the edge of the cleared area around the ranger station. It did not approach. It simply stood at the tree line, perhaps 150 feet away, looking at the pen where the captive creature was standing, looking back at it, a connection being re-established across years of separation. More creatures appeared as darkness fell. We counted at least 5, perhaps more, that remained hidden just beyond the perimeter of our vision. They surrounded the ranger station like a siege force, contained at a distance but unmistakably present, waiting for something. The federal authorities prepared for violence. They armed themselves. They set up barricades. They prepared to defend the station against what they believed would be an attack. But the creatures did not attack. They simply waited. Tom understood what was happening. He said that the creatures were not going to assault the station. They were not interested in violence anymore. They had gotten what they wanted. The young one had been returned. The lost family member had been restored. Now they were simply watching, deciding what came next, determining whether the human presence in their territory was going to be something that could be tolerated or something that needed to be eliminated entirely. At midnight, Tom made a decision. He said that we needed to open the pen. He said that we needed to allow the captive creature to leave. He said that we needed to demonstrate that we were honoring the implicit agreement that had been made. The other rangers objected strenuously. The federal agent said that it was impossible, that releasing the specimen would undermine their research, that it was not authorized. But Tom was insistent. He said that this was the only way, that if we held on to the creature, if we tried to keep it in captivity even temporarily, the fragile peace that existed would shatter. In the end, it was Tom who walked to the pen with a key to the gate. It was Tom who opened the barrier. It was Tom who stepped back and allowed the creature to walk free. The young Bigfoot did not immediately leave. It stood in the open gate for a long moment, as if it could not believe the barrier was gone. Then, slowly, it walked toward the tree line. It walked toward the wild creatures that had been waiting for it. And when it reached them, there was a vocalization from all of them, a sound that was complex and layered and that seemed to carry relief and anger and an ancient recognition. The young one had been returned. The family was whole. The wrong had been addressed. The creatures stood there for perhaps 5 minutes, and then they turned and retreated back into the forest. All of them, the wild ones and the captive one that was no longer captive. They moved away from the ranger station, deeper into the mountains, away from human civilization, back toward the cave and whatever territory they claimed in the deep places. The federal agents were furious. They said that Tom had sabotaged the operation. They said that he had released a documented species into an unknown environment. They said that the research opportunity had been destroyed. But Tom simply watched them go, and there was a look of profound sadness on his face, as if he had just witnessed something magnificent and terrible that could never be replicated, something that the human world was not equipped to understand. The creatures did not attack the ranger station. They did not emerge from the forest again. The disappearances and killings stopped completely, as if someone had thrown a switch and turned off the violence. The hikers who had reported the initial sighting eventually gave their accounts to the media. There was, as Tom had predicted, a media frenzy. Bigfoot had been seen. Bigfoot was real. The cryptid had emerged from legend into documented fact. But by the time the journalists and the cryptid hunters and the scientific community descended on the Sierra Nevada, the creatures were gone. They had retreated into the high mountains, into the wilderness areas that were still truly wild, into places where human presence was sporadic and minimal. They had taken the lessons of their year of violence and their negotiation, and they had chosen to return to isolation rather than attempt coexistence. Dr. Morrison and his facility became a matter of federal investigation. There were legal proceedings. There were attempts to prosecute him for the illegal capture and confinement of an unknown species. But nothing stuck. The laws were too unclear. The jurisdiction was too ambiguous. In the end, he was released. His facility was closed, and he disappeared from public life. The ranger station moved to a different location 2 years later. The area was, officially, being protected as a conservation zone where no human research activity would be permitted. Unofficially, it was being left alone because the people who made decisions about these things understood that some things were not meant to be interfered with. Tom remained as a ranger in the region for several more years before taking an administrative position at the regional office. I, after another year of working in the park, decided that I had learned enough. I had understood what it meant to be a human presence in wild territory that was not governed by human rules. I had seen what happened when human authority attempted to assert itself over creatures that did not recognize that authority. I left the Park Service. I found work elsewhere. I tried to convince myself that the entire experience had been some kind of elaborate delusion, a shared hallucination induced by isolation and fear and the human tendency to see patterns in randomness. But I knew better. The creatures had been real, the fear had been real, the violence had been real, and the lesson that the forest had taught me, the understanding that there were powers in the wilderness that transcended human comprehension, remained with me every day. Occasionally, in the years after leaving the park, I would receive letters from Tom. He never signed them with his actual name. He never included a return address, but they contained information. Updates on the creatures, sightings in remote areas of the park, evidence that they were still there, still monitoring the human presence, still deciding, night after night, whether the boundary between human and wild could be maintained. In the most recent letter, which arrived just last year, Tom wrote something that has never left my mind. He wrote that the creatures were changing, that they were becoming more visible, more bold, that the message they had sent with Eleanor Vasquez and Marcus Chen and all the others, the message that said humans needed to understand and accept their existence, had taken root in ways that humans were not consciously aware of. He wrote that other parks, other wilderness areas, were reporting incidents, sightings, disappearances, attacks, not the kind that made the news, because most of them were in remote areas where the missing people had been expected to disappear anyway. Hikers who vanished in the backcountry, researchers who did not return from field expeditions, solo travelers who simply never arrived at their destinations. He wrote that the creatures were learning. They were learning that humans would tolerate a certain number of disappearances, that if the killings were spaced out, if they occurred in remote places, if they were attributed to accidents or natural causes, humans would not mount a full-scale response. He wrote that the creatures were expanding their presence. They were moving into new territories. They were establishing themselves in places where they had not been seen for decades or longer. They were coming down from the mountains and approaching the edges of human civilization, testing the boundaries, determining what they could get away with. And he wrote that the creatures understood, now, that humans did not want to believe in them. That the human desire to dismiss Bigfoot as myth was stronger than the evidence of their existence. That humans would accept disappearances and rationalizations easier than they would accept the truth that something intelligent and powerful and beyond human control was sharing their world. The creatures, Tom wrote, had learned the greatest weapon against human resistance. They had learned that selective belief was stronger than documented evidence, that humans would look at proof and choose to see illusion rather than accept a reality that did not fit their understanding of the world. And if that was true, then the creatures had all the time they needed. They could continue their expansion unchallenged. They could continue their violence unmolested. They could continue their slow, steady reclamation of the wilderness that humans had foolishly believed belonged to them. I have not heard from Tom since that letter arrived. I do not know if he is still working for the Park Service or if he has disappeared into the mountains himself, become part of the documentation of something that official records will never acknowledge. But sometimes, at night, I still think about that clearing where the young Bigfoot was reunited with its family. I think about that moment when the creatures decided to step back from violence, when they chose to trust that humans might finally understand, might finally accept them, might finally let them live without constant threat of capture or destruction. I think about how that trust has been betrayed, how humans, in their infinite capacity for denial and compartmentalization, have simply pretended that the creatures do not exist and hoped that if they did not acknowledge reality, it would somehow stop being true. And I wonder how long it will be before the creatures decide that humans are past negotiating with, before they understand that coexistence is impossible, before they choose expansion and conquest over isolation and restraint, before they decide, finally and completely, that there is only room for one intelligent species on this continent, and it is not going to be us. Sometimes, late at night, I hear stories about people disappearing in remote areas, hikers who go into the wilderness and do not come back, researchers whose equipment stops transmitting, families whose camping trips end in unexplained tragedy that is attributed to bears or exposure, or the simple dangers of being in the wild. And I know what happened to them. I know who took them. I know that somewhere in the deep places of this country, in the mountains and the forests and the canyons, creatures are building a network of knowledge and capability and presence. I know that we have awakened something that wants to push back against human dominion, and I know that nothing short of a catastrophic action, something so massive and violent that it would shake the foundations of human civilization, would be enough to stop it now. The creatures are out there. They have always been out there. And now, after their year of killing, after their negotiation, after their carefully orchestrated demonstration that they were not to be trifled with, they understand their power. They understand that humans are not the only force in this land, and they are coming to collect on the debt that humans have owed them since the day the first rancher shot a Bigfoot and claimed he had killed a bear, since the day the first scientist looked at real evidence and chose to dismiss it, since the day the first government official decided to cover up what they knew and pretend it was all legend. The wilderness is vast, the mountains are deep, and in those places, intelligence watches and waits and plans. We have been warned. The creatures have told us what they are capable of. The question is whether we will listen before it is too late. Before it is too late. The radio crackled that morning the way it always did. Static, and then my dispatcher, Margaret, her voice thin and flat through the speaker mounted on the dashboard of my patrol truck. I had been working for the National Park Service for coming up on 10 years now, and I could read the weight in her delivery before she even said anything. Bad weather coming in, a report of hikers overdue, a structure fire at one of the ranger stations. Margaret never rushed. She would lay out the day in that calm, measured tone, and I would nod along like she could see me, which she could not. That morning was supposed to be simple. Maintenance patrol on the eastern ridge roads. Check for downed trees, assess the condition of the gravel thoroughfare that cut through the deepest part of Burnt Ridge National Forest. Make sure the boundary markers had not been disturbed by weather or animals. Routine work, the kind that let you think about other things while you drove. The kind that made the day pass faster. I had left the ranger station at Harlan Fork at 6 in the morning, before the sun had fully crested the ridgeline. The mountains around us were still painted in that pre-dawn gray, all soft edges and deep shadow. Fog sat in the valleys like something alive, like it was breathing. The truck rumbled beneath me. The coffee in my thermos was still hot. The road I took cut north through some of the oldest growth timber in the range. These were trees that had stood for 300 years or more. Hemlock and white pine, towering so high that on an overcast day you could lose sight of the canopy entirely. The forest floor beneath that canopy was a cathedral of silence. Moss grew thick on the north side of the trees. The air, even at the elevation of the road, smelled like rot and richness, like the earth was very old and very aware of every living thing that moved across it. I had made this patrol route at least 200 times, more than that. I knew every curve, every washout, every place where the road would crumble in a heavy rain. I knew where the white-tailed deer liked to stand at dawn. I knew where the black bears had turned over rocks the previous spring, their claw marks still visible in the exposed soil. I knew the forest the way you know a face you see every day. But on that particular morning, something felt different. I could not have articulated it. If someone had asked me why I was gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual, why I kept checking my mirrors every few seconds, why I had a knot in my stomach that my breakfast had not settled, I would not have been able to explain. There was no sound out of place, no obvious sign of trouble. The road was clear, the weather was holding, the radio was quiet except for Margaret checking in with other rangers at different locations, her voice patient and methodical. And yet, there was a sense of anticipation in the air. The way the wind moved through the pine branches did not sound like wind. It sounded like something was moving through the trees alongside me, keeping pace with my truck as I drove deeper into the forest. Every 100 yards or so, I would slow down and listen. Nothing. Just the tick and click of the engine cooling, the whisper of pine needles, the far-off call of a raven. Nothing. I pressed on. The road began to climb as it always did about 3 miles from the ranger station. The terrain grew steeper, the forest closed in tighter. There were places along this road where the canopy was so dense that you could only see a few feet in any direction before the trees became a wall of shadow. The truck struggled a bit on the inclines. The old 1997 Chevrolet that the Park Service had assigned to me was not designed for high-altitude mountain work, but it had held up well enough over the years. I saw the smoke before I rounded the bend that would bring me to the widest part of the road, the place where the forest opened up a little and a clearing fell away to the right, showing a view of the valley below. The smoke was dark gray, thick, and it was rising straight up into the still air. Not the kind of smoke you see from a controlled burn, not the kind that comes from a chimney or a campfire. This was heavy smoke, dense smoke, The smoke of something substantial burning. My stomach twisted. I had seen enough wildfire damage in my years with the Park Service to know that smoke meant nothing good. I reached for the radio and was about to alert Margaret to a possible fire when I rounded the bend and saw it. A van, completely engulfed in flames. It was parked in the exact center of the road, oriented lengthwise so that both lanes were blocked. The vehicle was old, maybe from the 80s or 90s, some kind of family cargo van that had been white at one time but was now barely recognizable as a vehicle at all. The metal of the exterior was black and twisted. The windows had blown out, the rubber of the tires had melted, leaving only the rims burning on the pavement. The interior was a roaring inferno, flames shooting up through the roof where the metal had split. Things were exploding inside it. Small pops and cracks like fireworks. The sound was tremendous even from 50 yards away where I had brought my truck to a stop. The heat radiating from the burning vehicle was so intense that I could feel it even through the windshield. I grabbed the radio. 911, structure fire on the North Ridge Road, approximately 4 miles from Harlan Fork Ranger Station. Vehicle fire, single vehicle, no initial sign of occupants outside the vehicle. Margaret was on me in seconds. Copy that, Ranger. Fire and rescue are 22 minutes out from your location. Do not approach the vehicle. I repeat, do not approach. Stand by. I took a breath. The heat was making the air shimmer around the burning van. The flames were so bright that I had to squint. I realized my hands were shaking. My first thought was that someone had broken down, abandoned the vehicle, and either someone else had come along and set it on fire, or it was a mechanical failure that had escalated into a full conflagration. People did strange things sometimes. I had seen a man set his own truck on fire in a suicide attempt, and he had survived, crawling out with severe burns across most of his body. I had seen mechanical fires that had started in the engine compartment and spread throughout the chassis in minutes. The possibilities ran through my mind as I sat in my truck, watching the van burn. I did not approach it. I had been trained well enough to know that a burning vehicle was unpredictable and dangerous. The van could explode, the tires could burst, the fuel tank could rupture. Instead, I kept my distance and I waited. I documented the license plate in my notes, though it was barely visible through the flames. I noted the exact location. I called in updates to Margaret every few minutes as the fire burned. The van burned for what felt like hours but was probably only about 30 minutes. By the time the fire department arrived, most of the fuel had been exhausted and the flames had died down to a smoldering mass of twisted metal and charred upholstery. The firemen were efficient and professional. They put out the remaining hot spots, cooled the vehicle down with water and foam, and then they began their examination. It was during that examination that they found him, the driver. He was still in the driver's seat. His remains were nearly unrecognizable. The heat had been so intense that his body had charred, the flesh consumed, and the bones exposed. The steering wheel had melted into his lap. The dashboard had collapsed on top of him. What was left was barely human in any meaningful sense. It was just burned meat and bone, so blackened and twisted that at first glance you might not have understood that you were looking at a person. The fire chief, a man named Roy Corbett who I had worked with several times over the years, looked at me across the width of the burned-out vehicle. His face was grim. He said, "There was a body in here, has been the whole time." I had not checked. I had stood back and watched the van burn, and the entire time there had been a man dying or already dead inside it. The thought made my stomach clench. Roy said, "He has been dead for hours, at least." The heat was so intense that there is no way to tell how long he was in there before the fire started. Could have been dead before the flames took hold. The police arrived next. Sheriff's deputies from the county seat, a man and a woman, both of them competent and practiced in their handling of the scene. They cordoned off the area with yellow tape. They photographed everything. They collected the license plate information and ran it while I stood nearby, giving my statement to the male deputy, a man named Henshaw who had a notebook and a pen and a face that suggested he had seen a lot worse than this. What I told him was simple. I had been on a routine maintenance patrol. I had come around the bend and found the vehicle already fully engulfed in flames. I had not approached it. I had called 911 immediately. I had waited for the emergency response. Henshaw wrote all of this down. Then he asked, "You did not see any other vehicles? No signs of another person in the area?" "No," I said. Just the van and the fire. It was ruled a suicide within days. The medical examiner determined that the man had poured gasoline into the vehicle and onto himself, locked the doors, and set it on fire. The evidence was there in the physical remains and in the chemical analysis of the ash and soot. He had been dead before I found the van. Probably had been dead for several hours. The police found no note, but they found an empty gasoline can in the vehicle. They found traces of accelerant on his clothing and skin. They found evidence of depression and financial ruin in his background. Case closed. The man's name was Harold Vance. He was 47 years old. He had lived in a small town about 2 hours away from the forest, a place called Beckley. He worked in construction or had worked in construction before the industry had collapsed, and he had lost his job and his health insurance along with it. He had a wife who had left him 5 years prior. He had no children. He had no real connections to anyone in the area. By all accounts, he had been alone in the world. What I could not understand, and what I still cannot understand, is why he had driven out to that particular road to do it. The North Ridge Road in Burnt Ridge Forest is not on the way to anything. It does not lead to a destination. It is a maintenance road, a ranger road, a place where you go if you are patrolling the forest or if you have taken a seriously wrong turn. It is not a place where you drive if you are looking for a scenic overlook or a peaceful place to think. It is deep in the woods. It is isolated. It is the kind of place where no one would find you. But it was not a secret place. It was not a place that was difficult to find if you knew it existed. It was right there on the park maps, a ranger's road, marked clearly, accessible from the main highway that cut through the northern part of the forest. Why had Harold Vance come there? The police said it did not matter. He had come there to die, and he had succeeded. Whether he had driven there deliberately or by accident was irrelevant to the end result. He was dead. His suffering was over. There would be an investigation, and there would be a file, and eventually it would be closed and he would be forgotten. But I could not forget it. I drove that road 2 days later on my next maintenance patrol. The burned-out shell of the van had been towed away. There was nothing left but the scorch marks on the asphalt and the smell of burned rubber and gasoline that still hung in the air. I stood at the spot where it had been, and I tried to understand why a man would choose to end his life in this particular place. There was nothing here, no view, no shelter, no significance that I could discern. The forest pressed in on all sides. The road was empty and quiet. There was no sign of any other human being for miles in any direction. This was a place where you could scream and no one would hear you. This was a place where you could die and no one would find you for days or weeks. This was exactly the kind of place where something terrible could happen. And as I stood there, listening to the wind move through the pine trees and feeling the weight of the forest around me, I became aware of something that I had not paid attention to before. The trees around that section of road were damaged, not burned, not scorched by the fire, damaged in a different way. Branches had been torn off, large branches, the kind that required significant force to remove. The bark on several of the larger trees had been stripped away in long vertical tears, exposing the pale wood underneath. The damage looked relatively fresh, maybe a few days old, maybe older. The damage looked like something had done it with force and intention. I circled the area, walking deeper into the forest on either side of the road. The damage continued. Trees with branches snapped, trees with deep gouges in the wood, as if something with claws had climbed them. I found a place where the ferns and undergrowth had been trampled flat, a wide path that led away from the road and disappeared into the deeper forest. The underbrush was torn up, scattered, destroyed, as if something large and heavy had forced its way through, as if something large had been moving through this area repeatedly, leaving signs of its passage carved into the landscape. I did not go further into the forest. Some instinct stopped me. Some voice in my mind told me that following that path was not wise. Instead, I returned to the road and I made a note in my ranger's log. Possible animal damage. Need to assess for wildlife concerns. I did not write down what I suspected, though I did not know what I suspected. I could not have named it. Not yet. I only knew that the burned van and the dead man inside it had not arrived at that location by chance. And I knew that whatever had damaged those trees had done it for a reason. That night, I sat in my small cabin at the ranger station and I pulled out my laptop and I began to search. I looked for stories about the Burnt Ridge area. I looked for local histories and wildlife reports. I looked for news articles about strange deaths or disappearances in the forest. I looked for accounts of animal attacks, hiking accidents, strange encounters. The internet provided me with plenty of material. camping forums, and cryptid enthusiast websites. A few poorly scanned newspaper clippings from the 70s and 80s. A Reddit thread about mysterious sounds in Appalachian forests. Another thread about animal mutilations found in the woods. And I found references to something that people called the dogman. The dogman, according to the various accounts and stories and testimonies I found online, was a creature that had been sighted throughout the Appalachian region for hundreds of years. It was described as bipedal, standing 7 to 10 feet tall. It had the head of a canine, a dog or a wolf, but the body of a human. It walked on two legs like a man but moved with the speed and power of a predator. It had been seen in the forests of West Virginia and eastern Kentucky, in the deeper areas where the human presence was limited and the wilderness still held sway. The accounts were consistent in some details and contradictory in others. Some people said it was a supernatural entity, a spirit or a curse. Others insisted that it was an undiscovered animal species, something that had survived in the hidden places of the Appalachian Mountains, something that humans rarely encountered because it was intelligent enough and fast enough to avoid us. Most of the accounts came from older people. Grandparents telling stories to grandchildren, people who lived on the margins of the forest, logging country or coal mining country, places where the wilderness still encroached on human civilization. They talked about hearing sounds at night that were not quite animal and not quite human. They talked about seeing shadows move through the trees at impossible speeds. They talked about animals found dead, torn apart, abandoned for reasons that made no sense. I read about a cattle mutilation from 1974, about a missing hiker in 1988 whose remains were never found, about a hunter who had claimed to see a tall figure moving on two legs through the deepest part of the forest, a figure that should not exist in any cataloged species of wildlife. About the sounds, always the sounds, howls that contained something like human language, cries that were neither animal nor human but something that existed in the terrible space between the two. The stories were old, they were fragmented and contradictory and the product of rural folklore and superstition. There was no evidence, there was no proof, there was nothing that would convince any serious investigator that such a creature actually existed. And yet, as I sat in my cabin with my laptop glowing in the darkness, reading account after account of people who claimed to have encountered this thing, I could not dismiss it entirely. I had lived in these mountains for 10 years. I had walked these forests. I had heard sounds at night that I could not identify. I had seen evidence of animal behavior that did not quite match what I would have expected from any known species. I had felt the weight of the wilderness around me, the sense that this place was vast and old, and that humans occupied only the smallest and most fragile margin of it. The burned van had been parked at a place where the forest was particularly deep and thick. The trees there were old growth. The darkness came early and stayed late. It was not a place where a tourist would stop to take photographs or where a family would have a picnic. It was not on the way to anywhere important. It was simply a maintenance road through the heart of the wilderness. Why would a man come to such a place to kill himself unless he had been drawn there by something, unless something had called him to that particular location, unless the burning van and the dead man inside it were not part of a story about depression and suicide at all, but part of a much larger and far more terrible story? I closed my laptop and I sat in the dark, and I listened to the wind moving through the pine trees outside my cabin. And I wondered if I was being foolish, if I was allowing old stories and folklore to poison my thinking, or if I was finally beginning to understand what was really happening in these mountains. Over the next few days, I began to pay closer attention to things that I might have overlooked before. I noticed the animals. The deer populations seemed to be declining in certain areas of the forest. The birds seemed nervous, skittish, ready to flee at the slightest sound. The bears were staying away from their usual territory near the northern ridge. It was as if the wildlife of the forest had been disrupted, driven away from certain areas, pushed toward the periphery where human presence was stronger. The damage to the trees was becoming more evident now that I was looking for it. Claw marks on the bark, branches torn from trunks as if by something large and impossibly strong. Paths through the undergrowth that suggested something large was moving through the forest regularly. The trails led deeper into the forest, away from the ranger roads, into places that were truly wild. And the sounds. One night, about a week after I had found the burned van, I heard something. I was in my cabin, alone, reading a report on water quality in the streams on the northern side of the park. It was late, maybe 11 o'clock, and the forest around the ranger station was quiet in the way that deep forests are quiet at night. A kind of heavy, pressing silence that is underlaid with the sounds of nocturnal animals going about their business. The rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth, the distant call of an owl, the wind in the branches, and then something else. A sound that started at the very edge of audibility, so faint that I almost did not hear it. It was a howl, but not like any animal howl I had ever heard. It was not the sound of a coyote or a wolf. It had something in it that was almost human, an inflection that suggested speech or meaning rather than pure animal vocalization. It lasted for about 10 seconds, rising and falling, and then it stopped. I sat very still and listened. The forest had gone completely silent. Even the small night sounds had ceased, as if the very wilderness had held its breath in response to that call. The howl came again, from a different direction. Or perhaps it was the same howl, echoing through the trees in a way that made it difficult to determine where it had come from. This time it lasted longer. I could hear something in it that sounded almost like language, syllables and rhythms that suggested that some kind of communication was taking place. And then it stopped again, and the forest remained silent, and I sat in my cabin with my heart beating fast and my hands shaking slightly. And I wondered if I had really heard what I thought I had heard, or if my mind had played a trick on me, filling in details and meaning where there was only the random sound of the wilderness. The next morning I called Roy Corbett, the fire chief who had discovered the body in the burned van. I said, "I have a question about that vehicle fire, the one from last week, the one where they found the body." Roy said, "What about it?" I said, "Did anyone examine the area around the fire more thoroughly? Did anyone look for signs of what might have drawn the vehicle to that location in the first place?" Roy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There was nothing to examine. The man drove out there and killed himself. It is straightforward, sad, but straightforward." I said, "What if it is not? What if there was something else involved?" Roy said, "Like what?" I could not answer that question. I could not articulate what I suspected because it sounded insane. A creature from local folklore luring a man to his death? The dogmen stalking the forests of Burnt Ridge, hunting humans, orchestrating their demise? It was the kind of thing that you read about in fiction or on paranoid websites, not the kind of thing that happened in reality. So instead I said, "I do not know. I just thought it was worth looking into." Roy said, "The case is closed, let it go. Sometimes people do bad things to themselves, and there is no reason behind it beyond their own pain. Accept that and move on." But I could not accept it, and I could not move on, because somewhere in the deep forests of Burnt Ridge, something was moving, something was leaving signs, something was calling out in the night with a voice that was almost human, and I was beginning to believe that the burned van and the dead man inside it were only the beginning of something far larger and far more terrible. I increased my patrols. I drove the maintenance roads more frequently. I looked for evidence. I found more tree damage, more paths through the undergrowth, more signs that something large and powerful was moving through this territory. I found places where the underbrush had been deliberately trampled flat, as if something was creating trails, establishing pathways, familiarizing itself with the landscape. And every few nights I heard the howl. Sometimes it came from the north, sometimes from the west, sometimes it came from multiple directions, as if there were more than one creature out there, communicating with each other across the distances of the forest. The sound never failed to send a chill down my spine. The sound never failed to make me question my own sanity. If you are watching this, if you are listening to this story unfold, I want you to understand something. I am not a man given to flights of fancy. I am not someone who believes in ghost stories or folklore or supernatural explanations for the ordinary events of the world. I am a man of science and reason. I believe in what I can see and touch and measure. I have worked in these mountains for 10 years without any truly extraordinary experiences beyond what anyone else might encounter in the wilderness. But something was happening. Something was changing in the forest around me. And I was beginning to understand that what had happened to Harold Vance, the man in the burning van, was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern. It was part of something larger, and I was terrified. The second incident occurred 19 days after I found the burned van. It was a disappearance. A hiker named David Thorne had failed to return from a day trip on the trails that ran through the northern section of the park. His wife had reported him missing after he did not come home by 6 o'clock in the evening. A search and rescue team was mobilized at first light. I was part of the team, along with Roy Corbett and several other rangers and volunteers who knew the forest well enough to navigate it without getting themselves lost. David Thorne was 42 years old. He was in reasonable physical condition. He was an experienced hiker who knew the trails in Burnt Ridge Forest well. He had hiked the same route dozens of times. He knew the weather patterns. He knew which trails were dangerous and which were safe. By all accounts, he was the kind of person who was very unlikely to disappear in the wilderness by accident. We began our search at the trailhead where David had left his car. It was a parking area about a mile from the North Ridge Road, a place where day hikers could leave their vehicles and access the trail system that led deeper into the forest. His car was still there, parked in the same spot where his wife had found it when she came looking for him the previous evening. The doors were locked. The interior was neat and organized. There were no signs of struggle or distress. The trail itself was well marked and easy to follow. It climbed steadily through mixed forest, hemlock and hardwood, and it led to a ridgetop about 4 miles away where there was a view of the valley below. The hike was not particularly dangerous or technical. It was a place where people took their children and their elderly parents. It was a place where David Thorne should have been perfectly safe. We spread out along the trail and we began to search. We looked for signs of David, any indication of where he might have gone or what might have happened to him. We called his name periodically, hoping that he would hear us and respond. The forest absorbed our voices. The mountains were indifferent to our concerns. We found his backpack about 2 miles up the trail, in a place where the trail curved around the side of a steep ravine. The backpack was lying on its side at the edge of the path, as if it had been dropped or discarded. The contents were scattered: a water bottle, some energy bars, a map of the park, a small first aid kit, everything that a day hiker would bring. But David was not there. Roy looked at the scene and said, "He must have gotten disoriented. Maybe he twisted his ankle and decided to leave his pack and go back to get help." But that did not make sense. If David had twisted his ankle, he would have stayed with his pack and waited for help to arrive. He would not have left it and wandered off into the forest alone. He would have used his cell phone to call for help. His phone was still in the pack, the battery dead. I looked at the ground around the pack and I saw something that made my skin crawl. Footprints, not human footprints. They were large, at least 12 inches long, and they had a strange shape. Not quite like a dog's paw, not quite like a human's foot. Something in between. The marks in the soil showed claws, long claw marks that extended perhaps an inch beyond where the paw pad would have been. There were several of them, arranged in a pattern that suggested the creature had been circling the backpack, circling the spot where David Thorne had dropped his pack and apparently wandered away. I knelt down to examine the prints more closely. My hands were shaking. I did not want to believe what I was seeing. I did not want to accept that what I was looking at could possibly be real. Roy came over and looked at the prints. He frowned. He said, "That looks like a large dog, maybe a mastiff or a Great Dane that someone let loose in the forest. But it was not a dog." I knew it was not a dog. The proportions were wrong. The claw marks were wrong. The spacing and the depth and the nature of the prints were all wrong for any dog I had ever seen. I said, "Look at the depth of the print. Whatever made this was putting enormous weight on that foot. Look at the claw marks. They are too long, too separated. This is not a dog." Roy stood up and looked around the forest. He said, "Then what is it?" I did not answer. I could not answer. Instead, I radioed back to the search command post and reported what we had found. I described the prints in detail and I waited for a response. What I got was skepticism. The officer at the command post said, "You are sure it is not a dog? A large dog can leave unusual prints depending on the terrain and the angle of the paw." I said, "It is not a dog," the officer said. "Continue searching for Mr. Thorne. Be thorough, but do not delay unnecessarily analyzing animal tracks." So I continued searching. We spread out further and we moved deeper into the forest, away from the trail, following the faint signs that David might have left behind. We found more of the strange prints, leading away from the trail and deeper into the wilderness. We found torn branches and crushed undergrowth. We found places where something large had moved rapidly through the forest, leaving a path of destruction in its wake. The prints led us to a place where the forest opened up slightly, a rocky outcropping that offered a view of the territory below. There was blood here, not a large amount, but enough to be significant. It was on a rock, dark and dried, and beside it was more of the strange paw prints, larger than any we had found before, pressed so deeply into the soil that the creature must have been carrying enormous weight, enormous power. Roy looked at the blood and he said, "This is not an accident. Something happened here. Something took David." I said, "Something like what?" Roy did not answer. He looked out over the forest, at the vast expanse of trees that covered the mountains in all directions. He looked afraid in a way I had never seen before. We searched for another 6 hours. We found no sign of David Thorne himself. We found more prints, more evidence that something had moved through this area. We found a piece of clothing, part of a sleeve from a hiking shirt, dark blue, torn and bloody. We found signs of a struggle, the earth torn up, bushes broken, as if two living things had fought for their lives. But we found no body. We found no remains. We found no David Thorne. The search continued for 3 days. Teams of rescue workers came in from surrounding areas. Dogs were brought in to track the scent, and within an hour those dogs were refusing to go further, pulling back toward their handlers, refusing to move into the deeper forest despite commands and encouragement. Equipment was mobilized. Helicopters circled overhead searching for any sign of the missing hiker. Nothing was found. By the 4th day, the official search was being scaled back. By the 5th day, David Thorne was being treated as deceased, lost to the forest, his body presumably decomposed or carried far away by scavengers before anyone could find it. His wife gave a press conference in which she spoke about how much she loved him and how much she missed him, and how she hoped that his remains would eventually be found so that she could give him a proper burial. She talked about his kindness and his gentleness and his love for the outdoors. She talked about how he had never done anything to deserve this, how he was a good man who had simply wanted to enjoy a day in nature. She did not know that he had been hunted. She did not know that something had come for him in the forest and that it had killed him and that it had left him out there, somewhere in the vast wilderness of Burnt Ridge Mountain, for the animals to scatter and the insects to consume and the weather to erase. I knew these things. I had seen the signs, and I was becoming certain that I knew what had taken David Thorne. The dogman. The creature from the old stories, the thing that moved through the Appalachian forests with intelligence and purpose, the thing that had left a message in its prints and in its violence, that it was not afraid of human beings and that it was not limiting itself to hunting game animals anymore. I began to keep a private log, a separate record of the evidence I was gathering. The prints I had photographed with my personal camera, the descriptions of the strange sounds, the reports of the animal populations being driven away, the patterns I was beginning to see in the locations where strange things were happening. A burned van and a dead man on North Ridge Road. A missing hiker on the trail system 3 miles to the east. 2 incidents, 2 deaths or disappearances, both occurring within a small geographic area. Both occurring at times when the creature could have been hunting without being observed or interrupted. I began to research more deeply. I contacted other rangers in nearby parks and forests. I asked them carefully, obliquely, if they had encountered anything unusual in their territories, if they had found strange prints or evidence of unusual animal behavior, if they had experienced missing persons cases that seemed strange or inexplicable. What I discovered was a pattern that stretched across the entire Appalachian region. A missing hiker in Pennsylvania in 1996, a mutilated animal discovered in West Virginia in 1999, a man who had disappeared from a remote cabin in eastern Kentucky in 2003, a group of hunters who reported a strange encounter on the border between Virginia and Tennessee in 2007, missing livestock in various counties along the Appalachian chain, strange tracks reported but not investigated, strange sounds reported but not taken seriously, deaths classified as accidents or suicides without thorough investigation, a pattern that had been unfolding for decades, invisible to official investigation because no one was looking for a pattern, because no one believed that the pattern could exist. I began to spend more and more time in the forest. I extended my patrols. I hiked trails during my off hours. I climbed ridges and examined every piece of evidence I could find. I took photographs. I collected soil samples from the prints. I recorded the sounds I heard on my portable digital recorder. The sounds were becoming more frequent. The howls came almost every night now, sometimes multiple times in the same evening. They echoed through the forest, communicating across vast distances, and I became convinced that I was hearing more than one creature, at least 2, perhaps more. They were out there in the deep forest, moving through their territory, hunting, establishing dominance, reproducing. They were thriving. One night, about 2 weeks after David Thorne had disappeared, I made a decision that I knew was foolish but that I felt compelled to make anyway. I decided to go into the deep forest at night. I took my truck and I drove to a point on the northern ridge where the road dead-ended at an old logging trail that had not been maintained in years. I parked my truck and I gathered my equipment, a powerful flashlight, a hunting knife, A gun, loaded, though I knew that bullets might not be enough to stop something that large and powerful. My portable digital recorder, a compass, and a map. I told no one where I was going. I left no note at the ranger station. I simply departed into the forest with nothing but my instincts and my growing obsession with understanding what was happening in this place. The forest at night was a different world. It was darker than I had expected. The canopy was so thick that even with a full moon, which we did not have that night, you could not see more than a few feet ahead. I used my flashlight to illuminate the trail, and the beam seemed small and insignificant against the vast darkness of the forest. The sounds were everywhere. I had moved perhaps a mile into the forest when I began to hear them, rustling in the undergrowth, branches breaking, the sound of something large moving parallel to me, keeping pace with my progress. I stopped and I listened and I heard it again, closer now, on my left side. I turned my flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing there. Only trees and darkness and the reflection of my light off wet leaves. I pressed on. The deeper I went, the stronger the sense of being watched became, the sense of presence. I was no longer alone in the forest. Something was aware of me. Something was tracking me the way a predator tracks prey. I could feel its attention like a physical weight, pressing against me from the darkness. I came to a ravine, a place where the earth had eroded away to create a steep declivity, perhaps 50 feet deep. The ravine was filled with darkness. I could hear water running at the bottom, a stream that cut through the deepest part of the forest. I stood at the edge, and I looked down, and I heard something move behind me. I turned quickly, flashlight raised, and I saw nothing, but I smelled it, a smell like wet dog and something else, something wild and wrong and dangerous. A musk that belonged to no animal I had ever encountered. The smell filled my nostrils and made me want to gag. It was the smell of a predator, of something ancient and powerful and utterly indifferent to human life. I heard a sound then, close enough that I could have reached out and touched it. A breathing sound, heavy breathing. The sound of something large taking in air. I spun my flashlight around, trying to locate the source of the sound, but there was nothing there. Only darkness and forest, and the sense that something massive and terrible was standing just outside the reach of my light, watching me, deciding whether or not I was worth the effort of hunting. I ran. I turned and I ran back the way I had come, crashing through the undergrowth, not caring about the branches that tore at my face and arms, only caring about putting distance between myself and that presence. My heart was pounding so hard that I thought it might burst. My breath came in ragged gasps. I did not look back. I did not check to see if I was being followed. I ran until I reached my truck. I climbed inside and I locked the doors and I sat in the darkness with the engine off, breathing hard, trying to slow my heart rate, trying to convince myself that I had not just encountered something that should not exist, but I knew that I had. I had been in the presence of the dog man. I had felt its attention, I had smelled its scent, I had heard its breathing, and it had let me live. For some reason, at some decision that I could not comprehend, it had chosen not to hunt me. It had let me run. It had let me escape. I sat in my truck for a long time. I did not turn on the engine. I did not drive away. I simply sat in the darkness, and I tried to understand what had just happened. After perhaps an hour, I heard the howl. It came from the forest, from the direction I had run from, and it was closer than any of the previous howls had been. It was a sound that contained rage and hunger and something that might have been amusement. It was a sound that said, "I know you are here. I know what you are. I know that you are watching and listening and trying to understand, and I am letting you know that I am aware of your awareness, that I am allowing this to continue, that when I am ready to end this game, I will end it." The howl lasted for nearly a minute, rising and falling, echoing through the forest, coming from different directions as if the creature was moving while it howled, pacing, circling, making sure I understood its power and its reach. And then it stopped, and the forest was silent again. I started the truck and I drove away from that place. I drove back toward the ranger station, my hands shaking on the wheel, my mind reeling with the implications of what I had experienced. I had gone to the forest to find the dogman, and the dogman had found me. The next morning I called in sick to work. I spent the day in my cabin, reviewing the recordings I had made, examining the photographs I had taken, trying to make sense of what I had experienced. I listened to the audio file from my recorder, the digital evidence of that night, and I heard something I had not noticed before. In the background of the recording, beneath the sound of my own movement and breathing, there was a sound, a low growl, a breathing that was not human. a presence that my recorder had captured even though I had not consciously acknowledged it at the time. The creature had been there. It had been closer than I had thought. It had been watching me. It had been hunting me, and somewhere in the dark recesses of my mind, some part of me that I could not fully access had known this, had recorded it even as the rest of me was fleeing in panic. The dogman was real, and it was smart enough and deliberate enough to have planned the death of David Thorne and the suicide of Harold Vance. It was orchestrating something. It was conducting a game that I did not fully understand, but whose rules were becoming clearer the more attention I paid to the evidence. And I was no longer certain that I was the hunter in this scenario. I had a terrible feeling that I was the hunted. The third week of June brought record rainfall to the mountains. The weather system that moved in from the west was relentless. It rained for 5 days straight, the kind of heavy, driving rain that turned the forest into a maze of streams and flooded gullies. The Park Service issued warnings about flash flooding. Several hiking trails were officially closed. The roads were made hazardous by water damage and debris. During that time, I continued my investigations. I knew I should not have. I knew that I was the only person who believed what was happening. To everyone else at the ranger station, to the official investigators, to the families of the dead and disappeared, I was still just a ranger named Marcus Webb. I was someone who did his job competently and without drawing undue attention to myself. I was not the kind of person who would claim to have evidence of a cryptid stalking the mountains. I was not the kind of person who would present theory as fact or folklore as evidence, so I worked in secret. I took soil samples from the areas where I had found prints, and I tried to analyze them, looking for any anomalies that might help me understand what kind of creature had made those prints. I took hair samples from the branches where I had found evidence of the creature brushing against trees. I recorded every sound I heard, every sign, every indication of the creature's presence. What I was doing was not scientific. What I was doing would never hold up to any kind of scrutiny or investigation. But it was all I had, and I was determined to gather as much evidence as I could, to build a case that might someday convince someone else that what I was experiencing was real. During that week of heavy rain, I drove the North Ridge Road repeatedly. The road had been damaged by the water, small sections of the asphalt broken up, drainage ditches overflowing. At one point I came around a bend and I found a tree that had fallen across the road, blocking passage. I would have called it in to be removed, except that something made me stop and examine the tree more closely. The tree had not fallen naturally. It had been pushed. The root system, which was still partially attached to the tree, showed signs that the tree had been deliberately toppled. The remaining stump showed claw marks, deep, powerful claw marks that suggested something with tremendous strength had gripped the tree and torn it from the earth. I stood in the rain, and I stared at that tree, and I understood that the creature was sending me a message. It was demonstrating its power. It was showing me that it could do whatever it wanted in this forest, that it could move mountains and fell trees and take lives, and that there was nothing I could do to stop it. That evening, back at my cabin, I made a decision. I was going to try to document everything. I was going to gather all of my evidence, all of my photographs and recordings and observations, and I was going to compile them into a single record, a journal, a chronicle of events, a permanent account of what was happening in the Burnt Ridge Forest. I spent the next several days writing. I documented the burned van and Harold Vance. I documented the disappearance of David Thorne and the evidence of the struggle. I documented the sounds I had heard, the prints I had found, the sense of being hunted. I documented my own experience in the forest, the night I had encountered the creature. I wrote about the history of dogman sightings in Appalachia. I wrote about the pattern of incidents that stretched back decades. I wrote about the accounts from other rangers in nearby forests, the missing persons cases, the mysterious deaths, the strange encounters. I wrote about my growing conviction that the creature was intelligent, that it was aware of human presence in its territory, that it was capable of planning and orchestrating events in ways that went far beyond simple animal behavior. I wrote about the burned van and the question that still haunted me. Why had Harold Vance driven to that location? How had he ended up taking his own life in that particular place? And my answer, my terrible answer, was that he had been drawn there, that the creature had somehow compelled him to go to that location, that the death had not been a suicide at all, but a murder orchestrated in a way that was so subtle and so perfect that it had been immediately classified as suicide by the authorities. I wrote about David Thorne and the same terrible theory, that the hiker had not simply gotten lost or been attacked randomly by a wild animal, that he had been deliberately hunted and killed by something intelligent, something that had taken satisfaction in the kill, something that had gone to the effort of ensuring that the victim suffered before dying. I wrote about my encounters with the creature, my narrow escapes, my growing understanding that I was not an investigator but a piece in a game that the creature was playing, that I was being toyed with, tested, evaluated. And then I wrote about what I believed was coming. I wrote that I believed the creature had a pattern, that Harold Vance and David Thorne were only the beginning, that there would be more deaths, more disappearances, more evidence that something terrible was happening in the Burnt Ridge Forest. I wrote that I believed the creature was preparing for something, that it was gathering itself, building its strength, waiting for a moment when it would make a more aggressive move, that the time might be coming when the creature would move beyond hunting isolated victims and begin to work at a larger scale. I had no proof of this. I had no evidence to support this theory. But the feeling was strong, and I had learned to trust my instincts in the forest. When I finished writing, I had a document that was approximately 30,000 words, a journal of horror and speculation, observation and theory, a record that could be read by someone else and might convince them that I was not insane, or might convince them that I was completely unbalanced and should be removed from my position. I printed the document and I bound it in a folder and I placed it in a locked drawer in my cabin. I told no one that it existed. I did not send it to anyone. I did not file it with the Park Service. I simply kept it as a record of my understanding. After I finished the journal, I tried to return to my normal duties. I tried to function as though nothing unusual was happening. I showed up to work. I performed my maintenance patrols. I attended the meetings and filled out the paperwork and did all of the things that a normal ranger would do. But I was different now. I was changed. Every sound in the forest made me alert to danger. Every shadow seemed to hide something. Every strange print or piece of evidence became immediately significant. I was always on guard. I was always watching. I was always afraid. And I was not the only one. Other people were beginning to notice things too. The first sign that the situation was escalating came when a family reported that their dog had been killed in a strange way. The dog, a German Shepherd, had been taken from their yard while they were inside the house. The next morning, they found the dog dead in the woods at the back of their property, about a quarter mile from the house. The body was torn apart. The wounds were severe, and the pattern of the attack suggested something large and powerful and deliberately vicious. The family lived in a small community about 5 miles from the edge of the national forest, on a road that led into the mountains. The second sign came when a woman reported hearing strange sounds near her home at night. Howls that seemed almost human. Sounds that made her feel unsafe in her own home. She said that she had heard scratching sounds on the side of her house, as if something was trying to get inside. The third sign came when a hunter reported seeing a strange figure in the forest, a tall shape that moved on 2 legs, larger than any human, moving with a speed that seemed impossible. The hunter said that he had only glimpsed the figure for a moment before it disappeared into the trees, but that he was certain that he had seen something that should not exist. These reports were being dismissed by the authorities as exaggeration or misidentification. The dog had been killed by a wild predator, probably a bear or a pack of wild dogs. The sounds near the woman's house were probably wind and animal noises, interpreted as more threatening because of the isolation. The figure the hunter had seen was probably a tall hiker or a bear standing on its hind legs, distorted by the poor lighting and the hunter's imagination. But I knew better. I knew what these reports meant. The creature was becoming bolder. It was approaching closer to human habitation. It was allowing itself to be seen, to be heard, to make its presence known. It was sending a message, and the message was clear. I am here. I am real. I am powerful. And you cannot stop me. In the middle of July, I decided to try a different approach. I reached out to a cryptid researcher named Professor Eleanor Blackwood, who worked at a university in Charleston, West Virginia, about 2 hours away from the mountains. I had found her through online research, an academic who studied folklore and legend and the ways that human culture processed encounters with the unknown. She was respected in her field, published in peer-reviewed journals, taken seriously by other academics. I emailed her a carefully worded message. I did not claim to have definitive evidence. I did not claim to have definitively identified a cryptid in the Burnt Ridge Forest. I simply described the unusual incidents that had been occurring and asked if she would be willing to discuss the possibility of unusual wildlife in the area. To my surprise, she responded within a few hours. She said that she would be interested in discussing the matter and asked if I would be willing to meet with her. We arranged a meeting for the following week at a coffee shop in the town nearest to Burnt Ridge, a place called Harlan. I was nervous about the meeting, afraid that I would come across as unbalanced or that she would immediately dismiss my claims as the product of an overactive imagination. But I needed to talk to someone. I needed to be heard by someone who might understand. Professor Blackwood was a woman in her 60s, with sharp eyes and gray hair and a manner that suggested she had heard many strange stories and did not dismiss them out of hand. We sat in the coffee shop and I told her about what I had experienced. I told her about the burned van and the dead man. I told her about the missing hiker and the evidence of the struggle. I told her about the prints and the sounds and the sense of being hunted. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked, "You believe that what you are experiencing is related to the Dogman legend?" I said, "I do. I know how it sounds. I know that I could be misinterpreting evidence or letting folklore influence my interpretation of ordinary events. But I believe that something is happening in the Burnt Ridge Forest, something that is not easily explained by conventional wildlife behavior, something that is intelligent and deliberate." Professor Blackwood said, "There have been dogmen sightings reported in the Appalachian region for centuries. The accounts are consistent enough to suggest that there is a kernel of truth in the folklore, though that kernel might not be what people believe it to be. It could be misidentification of known animals. It could be exaggeration of encounters with bears or wolves or feral dogs. It could be psychological phenomena, manifestations of fear or cultural expectation, rather than actual encounters with a physical creature," I said. "But you believe it is possible that there could be an unknown creature living in these mountains?" Professor Blackwood was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I believe that the wilderness is vast and that humans know less about the natural world than we would like to believe. I believe that it is possible for large animals to exist in remote areas without being formally documented by science. I believe that folklore often contains elements of truth, even when it has been distorted by generations of storytelling." She leaned forward. She said, "But I also believe that belief is a powerful force, that the human mind can be influenced by expectation and fear in ways that we do not fully understand. I cannot tell you definitively whether what you are experiencing is an encounter with an actual unknown creature or an encounter with your own mind, shaped by the wilderness and isolation and fear." I said, "I know, but I need to gather more evidence. I need to find a way to document this in a way that would be taken seriously." Professor Blackwood said, "If you do gather more evidence, bring it to me. I can help you analyze it. I can help you determine whether what you have is something that might genuinely indicate the presence of an unknown creature, or whether it is something that can be explained by conventional means." It was not the full support I had hoped for, but it was more than I had from anyone else. We exchanged contact information, and I left the meeting with a sense that I was not completely alone in this. In the following days, I became even more aggressive in my investigations. I set up trail cameras in locations where I had found evidence of the creature's passage. I created motion-triggered recording devices, sophisticated equipment that I was able to obtain through my contacts at the Park Service, claiming that I was conducting a wildlife survey. The cameras captured nothing, or rather they captured evidence of animal movement, footage of deer and bears and smaller creatures moving through the forest, but nothing that showed the dogman. It was as if the creature was aware of the cameras and had deliberately avoided them. I was becoming convinced that the creature was not merely intelligent but possessed of an almost human level of cunning. One night, about 2 weeks after I had met with Professor Blackwood, I received a phone call. It was my supervisor, a man named Thomas Hargrove, who was the chief ranger for the Burnt Ridge National Forest. He said, "Marcus, I need to speak with you about your recent performance and some concerns that have been raised." My heart sank. I said, "What concerns?" Thomas said, "Several people have mentioned that you have been acting strangely, that you have been taking extended patrols into areas that are not normally part of your assigned routes, that you have been asking strange questions about missing persons and unusual incidents. Some people are suggesting that you might be experiencing some kind of mental or emotional difficulty." I said, "I am fine. I am conducting a routine wildlife survey. That is why I have been in the forest so frequently." Thomas said, "A wildlife survey that you did not file the proper paperwork for? A survey that no one at the ranger station has any record of?" I was silent. I had failed to register my survey properly. I had tried to keep it quiet, to conduct my investigations without drawing official attention. Thomas said, "Marcus, I am concerned about your well-being. I think it might be good for you to take some time off. Get away from the mountains, get some perspective. Come back when you are feeling more like yourself." I said, "I do not need time off. I am fine." But I could hear the doubt in my own voice. I could hear the evidence of my obsession, my inability to maintain the pretense of normalcy. Thomas said, "Take 2 weeks off. That is not a request, it is an order, effective immediately. I want you to go somewhere else, somewhere that is not Burnt Ridge, and I want you to clear your head. When you come back, we can discuss your future with the Park Service." I tried to protest, but Thomas was firm. 2 weeks off, effective immediately. That night, I packed a bag and I left the ranger station. I drove away from Burnt Ridge Forest, away from the mountains, away from the place where I felt the presence of the creature like a constant pressure on my mind. I drove to a town about 4 hours away, a small city in the flatlands where there were no mountains, no wilderness, no sense of being watched or hunted. I rented a motel room and I tried to rest, but rest would not come. I lay in the motel room and I thought about the forest. I thought about the prints and the sounds and the sense of presence that I had felt so many times. I thought about David Thorne and Harold Vance. I thought about all of the other victims, all of the people throughout history who had encountered the creature and had not survived the encounter. I thought about what was happening in the forest while I was away. What was the creature doing? Was it continuing to hunt? Was it searching for more victims? Was it waiting for me to return? I called Professor Blackwood and I told her about my forced leave from the Park Service. I told her that I was afraid that I was not being taken seriously, that my evidence would be dismissed as the ravings of an unbalanced mind. She said, "Where are you?" I told her the name of the town and the motel. She said, "Stay there. I am going to drive to you. I want to examine your evidence more thoroughly. I want to take samples and analyze them and see if there is any objective proof that something unusual is occurring in the Burnt Ridge Forest." Professor Blackwood arrived 2 days later. I showed her the photographs I had taken. I played her the audio recordings. I showed her the samples I had collected, the soil and hair and debris that might contain evidence of the creature's presence. She examined everything carefully. She took notes. She photographed things. She asked detailed questions about the circumstances under which each piece of evidence had been gathered. When she was finished, she said, "This is interesting. There are some anomalies here that I cannot immediately explain. Some of the hair samples do not match any standard animal profile. Some of the prints, in photographs at least, show characteristics that are unusual." I said, "But you cannot confirm that they are evidence of the dogman?" She said, "No, I cannot. What I can say is that there is something here that is worth investigating further. But investigation requires more than anecdotal evidence. It requires scientific rigor. It requires time and resources." I said, "Time is something we might not have. I believe that the creature is preparing for something. I believe that more people will die." Professor Blackwood said, "Even if that is true, there is nothing we can do about it without evidence that would satisfy a proper investigation. We would need to capture the creature, or a clear photograph or video evidence or a body. We would need something that cannot be dismissed or explained away." I knew that she was right. I also knew that what she was suggesting was nearly impossible. The creature was too intelligent to allow itself to be captured. It was too careful to allow clear photographs, and it certainly was not going to leave its body behind for us to examine. We had come to an impasse. After Professor Blackwood left, I spent the remainder of my forced leave trying to rest and failing. My mind was always in the forest. My thoughts always returned to Burnt Ridge. I was losing the ability to exist in the normal world. I was becoming a creature of the wilderness, always alert, always afraid, always waiting for the next catastrophe to strike. When my 2 weeks were up, I returned to the ranger station. Thomas Hargrove looked at me carefully when I came back. He said, "You look like you have aged 10 years in 2 weeks." I said, "I am fine. I am ready to return to my duties." Thomas said, "I have been reviewing your records. I see that you have been keeping very detailed logs of unusual incidents in the forest. You have documented several strange animal behaviors. You have photographed unusual animal tracks. You have made a study of historical missing persons cases in the area." I said, "I have been conducting research." Thomas said, "Into what? What are you researching?" I could have lied. I could have made up a plausible explanation. Instead, I said, "I believe that there is an unknown animal species living in the Burnt Ridge Forest. I believe that this creature has been responsible for several deaths and disappearances. I have been trying to gather evidence that would prove the existence of this creature." Thomas was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Marcus, I need you to listen to me carefully. What you are describing sounds like the early stages of a psychological break. It sounds like obsessive thinking that has lost touch with reality. It sounds like you are experiencing symptoms that I have seen before in rangers who have spent too much time in isolation. I said, I am not delusional. Thomas said, I have decided to take you off active duty for an indefinite period. I want you to see a mental health professional. I want you to get evaluated by someone who can determine whether you are fit to continue working for the Park Service. Until that evaluation is complete and positive, you will not be permitted to work in the field. I wanted to argue with him. I wanted to make him understand that I was not crazy, that my evidence was real, that what I was describing was actually happening. But I knew that it would be futile. I knew that to everyone at the ranger station, I was a man who had spent too much time alone in the wilderness and had lost his grip on reality. So I accepted the order. I was placed on administrative leave pending psychological evaluation. I continued to receive my paycheck, but I was not permitted to go into the field. I was not permitted to conduct investigations. I was essentially confined to my cabin, cut off from the work that had defined my life for the past 10 years. And I was cut off from the forest. I was cut off from the creature. And I had no way of knowing what was happening out there in the deep wilderness while I was forced to remain in my cabin, waiting for a psychological evaluation that I knew would find me fit for duty, because I was fit for duty. I was not delusional. I was not having a break from reality. I was simply the only person who knew the truth, and no one would believe me. The psychological evaluation occurred 3 weeks later. The evaluator was a psychiatrist named Dr. Reginald Price, who worked for a private firm that provided services to the Park Service. He was a thin man with a precise manner and a skeptical expression. He interviewed me in a small office in Harlan for approximately 2 hours. He asked me detailed questions about my mental state, my sleep patterns, my substance use, my family history. He asked me about the evidence I had gathered and the theories I had developed. He asked me to explain my thinking in detail, to walk him through my logic, to articulate why I believed what I believed. I tried to be honest. I tried to explain what I had experienced in a way that would make sense to someone who had not experienced it himself. I tried to present my evidence logically, to show the connection between the disparate incidents, to demonstrate that my conclusion was reasonable given the facts. When I was finished, Dr. Price said, "Tell me, Mr. Webb, do you believe that this creature is deliberately targeting you, that it is communicating with you specifically?" I said, "I do not believe it is targeting me, but I do believe that it is aware of me, that it has been allowing me to gather evidence of its existence, that it is interested in me for some reason." Dr. Price made notes on his pad. He said, "That is a significant statement. You are suggesting that a creature that does not officially exist is deliberately interacting with you, that it is making choices that affect your life and the lives of others based on its awareness of you specifically." I said, "Yes." Dr. Price said, "And you recognize how that might sound to someone who is not experiencing what you are experiencing?" I said, "I do. But it does not change the fact that it is happening." Dr. Price continued with his questions, but I could already tell what the outcome would be. He was going to find that I was experiencing some form of delusional disorder, that my obsession with the creature was a symptom of mental illness rather than a response to actual events. He was going to recommend further psychiatric treatment. When the interview was complete, he said, "I will have my report to the Park Service within a week. You should expect to hear from your supervisor about the results." I did not ask what his preliminary findings were. I did not want to know. I already knew. What I needed to do was get back to the forest. I needed to get back before the administration used the psychological evaluation as a reason to terminate my employment or transfer me to another park far away from Burnt Ridge. I needed to see what was happening. That night, I drove up the mountain road toward the ranger station. I did not go directly to the station. Instead, I parked my truck at a point about a mile away, and I walked into the forest from there. I was off the clock. I was technically on administrative leave. I was not supposed to be in the forest, but I had to see for myself what had been occurring in my absence. The forest had changed. It was subtle, but it was noticeable to someone who knew the territory as well as I did. The animal populations were even more sparse than they had been. The birds were gone almost entirely, driven away or frightened into deeper territory. I found evidence of additional tree damage, more trees knocked down, more branches torn from trunks. The creature had been active, very active. As I moved deeper into the forest, I found something else, a camp. It was a crude structure, constructed from branches and undergrowth, tucked into a ravine where it would not be easily seen. Someone had been living there. I could see evidence of habitation. A small fire pit, cold now but relatively recent, food scraps, torn clothing, and blood, a lot of blood. I photographed everything. I tried to determine how long the camp had been established. Based on the state of decay of the materials, it looked like it had been occupied for at least a few days, possibly longer. Whoever had been living there was gone now. I continued searching and I found more evidence of the creature's activity. A place where several trees had been deliberately pushed down and arranged in a pattern that suggested deliberate construction. A path through the forest that was so well worn that it had become almost a trail, created by repeated passage of something large moving through the same route over and over. Signs of predation everywhere, torn carcasses of animals abandoned after feeding, and in the middle of all of this, another camp. This one was more recent. The fire was still warm. There were supplies scattered around, a backpack, a water bottle, food that looked like it had been freshly opened. Someone was using this camp. Someone was living in the forest deliberately. My mind raced through possibilities. Was this another victim? Someone who had come to the forest and been captured by the creature, being held here for reasons I could not fathom? Or was this something else? Was someone else investigating the creature? Had someone else come to the same conclusions as me? I took photographs. I documented everything. And then I heard the sound. A howl. Close. Very close. Closer than any of the previous howls had been. I grabbed my backpack and I moved quickly but quietly away from the camp. I did not run. Running would attract attention, would trigger a predatory response. Instead, I moved with purpose, keeping low, staying in the densest parts of the undergrowth, trying to make myself less of a target. The howl came again, from multiple directions. There were at least 3 of them out there, 3 creatures, 3 voices calling to each other across the forest. And I was moving toward the deepest part of their territory, away from the safety of the ranger roads, away from human habitation. I had made a terrible mistake coming into the forest alone at night. I realized this as the creatures began to circle me. I could sense their presence, their attention focused on me like a physical force. I was trapped in a ravine, surrounded by forest, with nowhere to run that would not lead me deeper into the wilderness. I drew my knife. It was a poor defense against something as large and powerful as the dogman, but it was all I had. The first one emerged from the trees in front of me. It was enormous. The accounts I had read had not prepared me for the reality of its size. It stood at least 8 feet tall, perhaps taller. Its body was humanoid in structure, with arms and legs that moved like a human being, but the proportions were all wrong. The legs were too long, the arms too powerful. The shoulders were massive, broadened by muscle and power, and its head was a nightmare. It was shaped like the head of a German shepherd or a wolf, but larger, scaled up to an impossible size. The jaw was massive, lined with teeth that gleamed in the darkness. The eyes were not the eyes of an animal. They were intelligent. They were aware. They were looking at me with an intensity that suggested conscious thought and deliberate intention. The creature opened its mouth and it made a sound. Not a growl, not a howl. A sound that contained elements of both, but that also contained something else. Something that was almost like speech, almost like words. As if the creature was trying to communicate with me in a language that I could not quite understand. Another figure emerged from the darkness to my left. Then another to my right. 3 of them. 3 dogmen surrounding me in the darkness of the forest. I did not run. I did not try to fight. I simply stood in the center of their circle, and I waited for the end. The largest one, the one I had first seen, stepped toward me. Each step was deliberate and slow. It was not rushing. It was not attacking. It was simply moving closer, evaluating me, deciding something. I raised my knife. I said, "If you are going to kill me, then kill me. But I want you to know that people know what I have been investigating. People know that I believe you exist. If I disappear, they will investigate. They will find evidence. They will come looking for you." It was a lie. No one knew. No one would come looking. But I said it anyway, trying to plant the idea in the creature's mind, trying to convince it that killing me would bring consequences. The dogman stopped. It tilted its head slightly, studying me. The other 2 remained motionless, watching. The sound came again. That almost speech, that terrible vocalization that seemed to bridge the gap between animal and human. The creature made the sound and then it turned and walked back into the darkness. The other 2 turned and followed. I stood in the darkness of the forest for a long time, my hands shaking, my heart pounding. I could not believe that I was still alive. I could not believe that the creatures had simply left. When I finally found the strength to move, I walked out of the forest. I walked back toward my truck. I walked in silence, afraid to make any sound that might attract them back. The night was the longest night of my life. When I reached my truck, I drove immediately away from the forest. I did not go to the ranger station. I drove directly to Professor Blackwood's home in Charleston. She answered the door at 6 in the morning, still in her nightgown, confused and concerned by my appearance. I looked terrible. I was covered in mud and scratches and leaf debris. My clothes were torn. My face was pale with shock and lack of sleep. I said, "I have encountered them, all three of them. They surrounded me. They let me live." Professor Blackwood pulled me inside. She said, "Tell me everything." I told her what had happened. I told her about the camps I had found, the evidence of occupation, the presence of 3 creatures in the forest. I told her about the encounter, the way they had circled me, the way they had allowed me to leave. Professor Blackwood listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "You need to go to the authorities. You need to tell them what you have found." I said, "They will not believe me. They have already concluded that I am mentally unstable. My psychiatrist is going to recommend that I be removed from the Park Service." Professor Blackwood said, "Then you need proof. Undeniable proof. A photograph, a specimen, a body. Something that cannot be explained away or dismissed." I said, "How do I get that? These creatures are intelligent. They are careful. They have allowed me to gather circumstantial evidence, but nothing that would satisfy a scientific investigation." Professor Blackwood was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Perhaps that is because they want you to gather evidence. Perhaps they are allowing this to continue because it serves some purpose of theirs." The thought had occurred to me, but I had tried to push it away. The idea that the creatures were deliberately allowing me to document their existence was terrifying in a way that simple predation was not. I said, "Why would they want that?" Professor Blackwood said, "I do not know, but it suggests an intelligence that goes beyond the animal kingdom. It suggests something that understands media, that understands documentation, that understands how humans process and accept information." She paused. She said, "It suggests something that wants to be known." I left Professor Blackwood's house later that day. I had rested for a few hours, cleaned myself up, and tried to process what had happened. But I knew that I could not stay away from Burnt Ridge. I had to return. I had to continue investigating. I had to find the evidence that would convince someone else of what I had experienced. I drove back to the mountains. I stopped at the ranger station, and I found that my evaluation results had been delivered. Dr. Price's report concluded that I was experiencing symptoms consistent with obsessive-compulsive personality patterns combined with possible delusional disorder. He recommended that I be removed from active duty for an extended psychological treatment program before any determination could be made about my future with the Park Service. Thomas Hargrove handed me the report personally. He said, "Marcus, I want you to take this seriously. Dr. Price is a respected professional. He believes that you need help. I think he might be right." I said, "When do I need to start this treatment program?" Thomas said, "Next week. There is a facility about 2 hours away. You will be enrolled as a residential patient. You will be there for a minimum of 30 days while they evaluate you and provide treatment." I said, "And my job?" Thomas said, "Your position is currently protected, but if the treatment program recommends that you are not fit for duty, the Park Service will have to make a decision about your future." I nodded. I accepted the news without protest. I knew that I would not be going to any treatment facility. I knew that I was going to disappear into Burnt Ridge Forest, and I was not going to come back until I had found what I was looking for. That night, I packed my truck with supplies, camping equipment, food, water, first aid kit, my recording devices and cameras, my knife and my gun, maps and a compass. Everything I would need to survive in the forest for an extended period. I left a note on my cabin door saying that I was going to my sister's house for a while, that I would be out of contact. I knew that it would buy me time before anyone came looking for me. And then I drove into Burnt Ridge Forest, and I did not return to civilization. I spent the next month living in the forest. I created camps in various locations, moving every few days to avoid establishing a pattern that the creatures might be able to predict. I continued to search for evidence, to photograph prints, to record sounds, to document the presence of the creatures, and I began to understand something. The creatures were not just hunting randomly. They were not simply predators defending their territory. They were deliberately marking locations, leaving signs, creating a pattern that suggested purpose and intention. I found a place where several trees had been deliberately arranged to create a kind of gateway or arch. I found evidence of symbols carved into rocks, marks that looked almost like language or writing. I found a place where the creatures had gathered regularly, A clearing where the ground was packed hard from repeated use, where the smell of the creatures was so strong it was almost overwhelming. It was a meeting place. The creatures were gathering for something. They were preparing for something. And whatever it was going to happen soon. August came to the mountains with humidity so thick that the air felt like a living thing. The forests steamed in the heat. The streams ran low, their banks exposed and cracked from lack of water. The wildlife pushed deeper into the high country where it was cooler, where water was more plentiful. I pushed deeper as well, following the creatures, tracking their movements, documenting everything I could find. By the third week of August, I was more animal than human. My clothes were ragged and torn. My hair and beard had grown long and wild. I had lost weight, living off of the supplies I had brought and the game I was able to hunt. I had learned to move through the forest as silently as the creatures themselves, to sense their presence before I saw them, to understand the language of their howls and calls. And I had discovered something that changed everything. The clearing I had found was being prepared for something. The creatures had been working on it deliberately, clearing brush, removing obstacles, creating an open space that was large enough for some kind of gathering. The ground around the clearing was marked with the prints and scent marks of multiple creatures. I counted at least 5 different individuals visiting the clearing, moving through it, using it as a meeting point. 5 dogmen, not 3. 5. And based on the different sizes and the patterns of the tracks, I believed that there might be more. That the 5 I had counted were only part of a larger population, perhaps a pack, perhaps a family unit, perhaps something larger still. I set up a camera trap at a distance from the clearing, hidden in the dense undergrowth, angled to capture the full clearing. I set it to record continuously, to document everything that happened at this location. For 3 days, nothing. The clearing was used, I could tell by the fresh marks and scents, but the camera did not capture anything. The creatures were avoiding the camera. They knew it was there, they had found it, and they were deliberately keeping their distance. On the 4th day, I discovered that the camera had been destroyed. It had been smashed with sufficient force to destroy the internal mechanisms. The lens was shattered, the casing was cracked. It was not simply damaged, it was destroyed with deliberate intent, as if the creature that had found it wanted to make sure that it could not be used again. I set up another camera, in a different location. This one lasted only 2 days before it was similarly destroyed. The creatures knew what I was doing. They knew that I was trying to document them, and they were preventing it. That was when I realized that they had been allowing me to exist in the forest not out of indifference or curiosity, but out of deliberate choice. They had let me live when they could have killed me. They had avoided my cameras in ways that suggested they understood what cameras were and what purpose they served. They were playing with me. They were testing me. They were waiting for something. On the 28th of August, something changed. The howls began at dusk and did not stop through the night. They came from multiple directions, from different locations scattered throughout the deep forest. The creatures were calling to each other, communicating across vast distances, gathering like a pack converging on a kill. I moved toward the sound, against all logic, against every instinct of self-preservation that had kept me alive for the past month. I moved toward the creatures. I wanted to see what was happening. I wanted to understand what all of this had been building toward. The gathering in the clearing began after midnight. I approached from the north, moving carefully, using the cover of the forest to conceal myself. The clearing was illuminated by moonlight, a silver space in the darkness of the forest, and in that clearing the creatures had assembled, 7 of them, 7 massive dogmen standing in a semicircle, facing toward the center of the clearing. They were not moving. They were simply standing, watching, waiting. I took up a position in the undergrowth and I watched. At first, nothing happened. The creatures simply stood in the darkness, silent, completely still. Minutes passed. 5, 10, 20. The night was heavy with anticipation, and then they began to move. They moved in a pattern, a deliberate choreography that suggested this was a ritual, something that had been performed before, something that they knew well. They circled the center of the clearing, moving in unison, their movements synchronized in a way that seemed to defy the independence of individual creatures. As they moved, they began to vocalize. The sound was unlike anything I had heard before. It was not a howl, it was not speech. It was something that contained elements of both, but it was also something entirely different. It was a sound that existed in a range that made my bones vibrate. It was a sound that seemed to carry meaning and emotion and purpose. The creatures were singing. That was the only way to describe it. They were singing in a language that predated human speech, that belonged to a time before civilization, when the only communication in the forests of the world was the voice of predators and prey and the vast, indifferent forces of nature. The song lasted for perhaps 5 minutes. When it ended, the creatures stopped moving. They stood in a loose circle in the center of the clearing, their heads raised, their mouths closed, their eyes surveying the darkness around them, and then one of them moved. A figure emerged from the darkness at the edge of the clearing. It was human. I recognized him immediately from newspaper photographs and missing person bulletins. It was David Thorne, the hiker who had disappeared 3 months ago. Except it was not David Thorne anymore. He was transformed. His body was covered in something that looked like fur or hair or hide, a covering that was neither animal nor human. His face was partially transformed, the jaw extended, the teeth sharp, the eyes glowing with an intelligence and awareness that no human eyes possessed. He moved into the center of the circle of dogmen, and he made a sound, a vocalization that seemed to answer the song the creatures had been singing. I realized then what had happened. David Thorne had not been killed by the creatures, he had been captured by them. He had been taken into their world, transformed by whatever mysterious process they possessed, and he was being inducted into their society. He was being made into one of them. The creatures around him continued their vigil, watching him, welcoming him into their circle, and I understood what was happening. This was an invasion, not a sudden assault, not a military campaign, but something slower and more subtle. The creatures were infiltrating human society. They were kidnapping people, transforming them, making them into something that was neither human nor dogman but a hybrid, something that could function in both worlds. Harold Vance had not committed suicide. He had been the first attempt, and something had gone wrong with his transformation. The process had been too much for his body to endure, and he had run from the forest burning, literally consumed by the change that was happening within him. David Thorne had been the second attempt, and this time the transformation seemed to be working. How many others were there? How many people had disappeared in the Appalachian Mountains over the years, classified as lost hikers or suicides or victims of animal attacks, who had actually been captured and transformed by the creatures? I reached for my camera, knowing that this was the evidence I had been searching for all along. But my hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold it. The camera clicked, the flash illuminating the clearing for a fraction of a second. It was enough. Every creature in the clearing turned toward the sound. Every creature turned toward me. I bolted from my hiding place, and I ran. I ran through the forest in darkness, crashing through undergrowth, jumping over fallen logs, driven by pure animal panic and survival instinct. Behind me, I could hear them crashing through the forest as well, pursuing me, their massive bodies moving with a speed that seemed impossible for creatures so large. I ran for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. My lungs burned, my legs felt like they were going to give out. The darkness was absolute, and I could see nothing, could only run in the general direction I hoped would lead me out of the deep forest and back toward civilization. A hand grabbed my shoulder. No, not a hand, a paw. A massive paw with claws that dug into my flesh, drawing blood, holding me firmly. I stopped running. I turned to face the creature that had caught me, and I saw that it was the largest of them all. The one I had first encountered, the leader, the one that had the intelligence and awareness that went far beyond simple animal instinct. The creature looked at me, its massive head tilted slightly, studying me. The claws dug deeper into my shoulder, causing pain that was sharp and immediate, and the creature did something unexpected. It released me. It withdrew its claws from my shoulder and it stepped back, creating distance between us. The other creatures emerged from the darkness and formed a loose circle around me, but they did not attack. They simply stood there, watching me, waiting. The largest one made a sound, a vocalization that contained something almost like speech. It was not a howl, it was not a growl, it was a deliberate sound that contained meaning. I understood, somehow, what the creature was trying to communicate. It was offering me a choice. It was showing me what had happened to David Thorne. It was showing me the transformation, the elevation, the change from human to something more. It was offering me the same choice. Join them, become one of them. Undergo the transformation and walk between the human world and the creature world, or refuse, and the creatures would let me go. They would allow me to return to civilization with my evidence, with my photographs, with my documentation of their existence. But the moment I tried to tell anyone what I had seen, the moment I tried to convince anyone of the truth, they would come for me. They would take me into the forest and they would transform me regardless of my choice. The choice was an illusion. I raised my camera, the camera that I had managed to hold onto during my flight through the forest. With hands that were barely steady, I took a photograph of the largest creature. I looked directly into its eyes, and I pressed the shutter button. The flash illuminated the clearing for a fraction of a second. In that fraction of a second, I saw everything. I saw the intelligence in the creature's eyes. I saw the amusement. I saw the ancient power that had existed in these mountains long before humans had come to this place. I saw the civilization and the culture that the creatures possessed, hidden from human awareness, moving through the deep wilderness according to rules and hierarchies that had nothing to do with human society. And I saw that I had been right all along. The creature was real, the dogman was real, and they had been waiting for someone like me, someone who would finally understand them, finally believe in them, finally document their existence, to bring their story to the human world. The creature stepped back, and the circle of creatures opened. I was free to go. I did not run again. Instead, I walked. I walked out of the deep forest, back toward the ranger roads, back toward the places where human civilization existed. The creatures did not follow. They simply watched me go, allowing me to leave, allowing me to carry my evidence and my knowledge back to the human world. By dawn, I had reached the boundary of the deep forest. By midday, I had reached the ranger roads. By evening, I had reached my truck. I drove out of Burnt Ridge National Forest, and I did not look back. I drove for 2 days without stopping. I drove south through Tennessee, through Georgia, until I reached a small town in northern Florida. I checked into a cheap motel and I collapsed into bed, sleeping for 14 hours straight. When I woke up, I downloaded the photographs from my camera. The photos were clear, undeniable. They showed the clearing, the creatures, the transformed David Thorne in the center of the circle. They showed 7 massive dogmen standing in a ritual formation. They showed something that should not exist according to every classification system of modern zoology. I had the evidence, but I had no idea what to do with it. I could not go to the authorities. I was wanted by the Park Service. I was considered mentally unstable. I was wanted for questioning regarding my disappearance. Any attempt to present evidence would be met with skepticism and investigation into my mental state, rather than investigation into what the photographs actually showed. I could contact the media, but what would happen then? A story about a mysterious creature in Appalachia would be dismissed as hoax or fantasy or the product of a mentally unstable former ranger. The photographs could be dismissed as elaborate forgery or misidentification. I could go to Professor Blackwood, but what could she do with the evidence that I could not do myself? I realized that I was trapped. I had the proof of the creature's existence, but I had no mechanism to make anyone believe me. The creatures had been clever. They had let me gather evidence, knowing full well that the evidence would be dismissed. They had let me keep my freedom, knowing that I would use it to try to convince others of something that they would never believe. I spent 3 days in that motel, staring at the photographs, trying to figure out what to do. On the 4th day, I made a decision. I was going to tell the story, not to authorities, not to the media in a conventional way. I was going to tell the story the way stories had been told for thousands of years, the way folklore and legend were passed down through communities. I was going to become a narrator. I spent that week learning how to tell the story in a way that would reach people. I learned about podcast platforms and YouTube channels and online narration communities. I learned about the audience that existed for stories like this, stories that blended horror and mystery and possibility. And I realized that there were already communities of people who believed in the dogman. People who had their own encounters, their own stories, their own evidence. People who were not crazy, who were not delusional, but who had experienced something that conventional society refused to acknowledge. I contacted a content creator who ran a horror narration channel, someone who specialized in stories about cryptids and supernatural encounters. I told him my story. Not the full story, but enough of it to give him the sense of what had happened. He was interested. He wanted to know if I could record the story myself, if I could deliver it in first-person narrative form suitable for upload to his channel. I said yes. I spent the next month in that small town, staying in motels, eating cheap food, recording my story in bits and pieces. I narrated the discovery of the burned van. I narrated the disappearance of David Thorne. I narrated my own investigations and my encounters with the creatures. I narrated the gathering in the clearing and the offering of transformation. I recorded it all, and I edited it all, and I crafted it into a story that was both true and compelling, that conveyed the horror and the wonder of what I had experienced without ever overtly claiming that the events were literally true. I submitted the recordings to the content creator, and he uploaded them to his channel. The response was immediate. The story went viral in the cryptid community. People shared it. People discussed it. People made art based on it. People created response videos and theories about what the dogman's intentions might be. Some people believed it was a true account. Others dismissed it as fiction. Most people existed somewhere in the middle, unsure whether they were listening to a true story or an elaborate fiction, which was exactly where the creatures wanted people to be. Because in that space of uncertainty, the creatures thrived. In that space where people could not be certain whether the danger was real or imagined, where they could not be certain whether the mountains contained a genuine threat or merely the folklore projections of anxious minds, the creatures were free to move unimpeded. A month after I released the first recordings, I received an email from a police department in West Virginia. They were investigating missing persons cases that had occurred in the Burnt Ridge area. They had come across my recordings. They wanted to interview me. I panicked. I knew that any direct investigation would lead to questions about my mental state, my disappearance from the Park Service, the events of the previous years, but I also knew that I could not run forever. I contacted Professor Blackwood. She said, "You need to come forward. You need to tell the police what you know. You need to trust that the evidence you have will speak for itself." I said, "The photographs can be dismissed as forgery. My story can be dismissed as the delusion of a mentally unstable person. What do I actually have that cannot be explained away?" Professor Blackwood said, "You have the story, you have the documentation, you have the consistency of your account. You have the fact that other people are now reporting similar experiences because they have heard your story and they are paying attention to their own experiences." She said, "You have started something. You have introduced doubt into the system. You have suggested that it is possible for things to exist in the mountains that official science has not catalogued, and that doubt, once introduced, cannot be eliminated. It will spread, it will grow, and eventually someone will take it seriously enough to investigate thoroughly," I said, "or they will simply decide I am crazy and lock me away." Professor Blackwood said, "Perhaps, but at least the truth will be out there. At least people will know. And knowing is the first step toward confronting the reality of what exists in our world." I agreed to cooperate with the police investigation. I contacted the detective in charge and I arranged a meeting. I met with them in a neutral location and I told them what I knew. I provided the photographs. I provided recordings of the strange sounds I had documented. I provided my detailed notes on the locations where I had found evidence. The investigation dragged on for weeks. The photographs were examined by experts in digital forensics. They were deemed to be unaltered and consistent with a genuine encounter with an unknown animal. The recordings of the creature sounds were analyzed by wildlife experts. They were deemed to be unlike any known animal vocalizations, though they were not definitive proof of anything extraordinary. The evidence I had gathered was not enough to prove anything conclusively, but it was enough to suggest that something unusual had occurred in the Burnt Ridge area. The police investigation into the missing persons cases continued, but it was eventually closed due to lack of evidence of foul play. The prevailing conclusion was that David Thorne had been lost in the wilderness and had perished from exposure or animal predation, and that Harold Vance had indeed committed suicide as originally determined. But something had changed. The investigators had been forced to acknowledge that my story was consistent, that my evidence, while not conclusive, was not easily dismissed, that something unusual did appear to be occurring in the Burnt Ridge area. A ranger from another jurisdiction called me and said that he had heard my story. He said that he had experienced something similar in the mountains where he worked. He said that he had found strange prints and heard strange sounds. He asked if I would help him investigate. Then another ranger called. Then a cryptid researcher. Then a hunter who had seen something strange in the forest. Then a woman whose family had gone missing decades ago, and she believed the disappearances might be connected to the creature I had described. A network began to form, a network of people who believed in the dogman, a network of people who were paying attention to the evidence, a network of people who were taking the creature seriously rather than dismissing it as folklore. And the more attention that was paid to the creature, the more the creature seemed to exist. Or perhaps the creature had always existed, and it was only our awareness of it, our acknowledgement of it, our refusal to deny it, that was changing. 6 months after my escape from the forest, I received another communication. It came through an encrypted email service. The message was short. "You have done well. You have brought our existence into the human world. You have introduced the possibility of our reality into spaces where we could not reach before. For this, we are grateful. But your role in this is not yet complete. There are others who are beginning to believe, others who are beginning to see, others who are beginning to search for us. These people will need guidance. These people will need you to help them understand what we are and what we want. We will contact you again with instructions. Until then, continue to tell the story. Continue to ensure that doubt takes root in the human mind. Continue to prepare your kind for the reality of our existence. The email had no signature. It could have been a hoax, someone playing a trick on me, someone using my story to manipulate me further. But I knew better. I knew that the creatures were still watching, that they were still monitoring my actions, that they were still orchestrating a plan that went far beyond anything I could comprehend. I knew that I was a pawn in a game that had begun long before I found the burning van on that dirt road. A game that would continue long after I was gone. I was no longer a park ranger. I was no longer a man attempting to understand a mystery. I was an instrument of revelation. I was a herald of the dogman, and my story was only the beginning. The burning van and the dead man inside it had been the opening move. The disappearance of David Thorne had been the acceleration. The gathering in the clearing had been the declaration of intent, and my story, told and retold across thousands of platforms and communities, was the spreading of the word. The dogman was real. The dogman was here, and the dogman was not hunting for food anymore. It was hunting for acceptance. It was hunting for acknowledgement. It was hunting for a world where it no longer had to hide in the shadows of the deep forest, but could walk freely in a human world that had finally learned to see it. I do not know if that world is coming. I do not know if the creatures will succeed in their grand design. I do not know if humanity is ready to accept that we are not alone, that there are other intelligences in the wilderness, that our dominion over this planet is not as complete as we have always assumed. But I know that the process has begun, and I know that I cannot stop it, even if I wanted to. The story has been told. The evidence has been presented. The seed of doubt has been planted, and in that garden of uncertainty, something will grow. Something is already growing. In the deep forests of Appalachia, in the mountains where the wilderness still holds sway over human civilization, the dogman is gathering its kind. It is preparing for something. It is waiting for the moment when the revelation will be complete, when the separation between the human world and the creature world will dissolve, when we will finally have to accept that we share this land with other beings, other minds, other forces. I am still alive. I am still free. I still maintain the choice to run, to hide, to disappear into obscurity and try to forget what I have learned. But I will not run. I will not hide. I will continue to tell the story. I will continue to prepare others for the truth. And when the creatures come for me, when they finally decide that my transformation is necessary and inevitable, I will accept that choice, because in the end, I do not believe they want to destroy us. I believe they want us to become part of their story, and that is a truth that terrifies me more than anything else. This is the story of the burning van. This is the story of the dogman of Burnt Ridge. This is the story of my encounter with something that should not exist, something that challenges everything we believe about the natural world and our place in it. And this is my testimony. Believe it or not, accept it or deny it, the choice is yours. But know that somewhere in the mountains of West Virginia and eastern Kentucky, in the deep forests where the wilderness remains untamed and free, something is moving, something is watching, something is waiting, and its story is far from over.